Okay. You're recording?
Yep.
Okay, welcome everybody to the AMC IRST meeting today. It's great to be with you. My name is Lisa Debricare. I'll be moderating today's meeting. We've got a great lineup of speakers. Before we get to introductions, we'll want to make sure we've got a quorum. I'm pretty sure we do at this point, but we'll want to double check on that. So we've got a pretty robust agenda for today. We're going to learn about the HCP biological goals and objectives. We're going to have a presentation on compliance monitoring, lunch, and then a presentation on ODFW's monitoring program. And then this last agenda item for the day is really going to be a discussion. It's intended to be a discussion about the effectiveness monitoring strategy and how you as two committees are thinking about approaching it. Okay, so it's going to be a pretty open conversation about this is where we're at. These are things that we might want to be thinking about and any next steps you may want to take as individual committees. And Seth and Stacy, I'll be looking to you two to help sort of lead and guide that discussion. And we'll do what we can to help support that in any way. Are there any questions about the agenda before we get started with introductions? Okay, let's go around the room and then we'll go around the virtual room for introductions. Terry, let's start with you.
Terry Free, ODF Adaptive Management Program Coordinator.
I am Julie Furman with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Matt Coble, ODF Water Quality and Monitoring Manager.
Matt Strickland with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Haley Holmes, salmon biologist with Trout Unlimited.
Dr. Weichel, ODF HCP coordinator.
Kate Johnson, ODF HCP tracking coordinator.
I'm Becky Flycroft. I'm with the IRST, but I'm a fish biologist with the U.S. Forest Service and Pacific Northwest Research Station.
I'm Kelly Burnett, and I am the co-chair of the IRST, and I am, fish biologist, I guess.
Seth Barnes, policy with Oregon Forest Industries Council, co-chair of the Adaptive Management Program Committee.
Ellen Bishop, I'm on the IRST as a conservation representative, and I'm a geologist by training.
Will Tucker, a county commissioner representing the Association of Oregon Counties.
Wendy Gerlach, I'm the Coalition of Oregon Land Trusts representative on AMPC, and I'm a lawyer in conservation transactions.
Josh Seeds, I'm an ecologist with Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. Sean Gordon, I'm with Oregon State Institute for Natural Resources and staff support for the IRST.
I'm Lisa Gaines. I direct the Institute for Natural Resources at Oregon State University and Portland State University.
I think we missed one in the back room, orange shirt, ball cap.
Yeah, Thomas Whittington, sitting in for a little while. I'm a water quality specialist, Forest Resource Division.
Thank you. And Amanda?
Yeah, good morning. Amanda Sullivan Astor, Forest Policy Manager with Associated Oregon Loggers and member on the AMPC.
And for our virtual people, Michael.
Hi, I'm Michael Furness. I'm a hydrologist. I'm associated with Cal Poly Humboldt as an adjunct professor, and I'm a member of the IRST.
Thanks, Michael. David?
Hi, excuse me, I've got a bad cold here. I'm Dave Bugney. I'm representing the Oregon Small Woodlands Association.
Thanks, David. Josh?
My name is Josh Roaring. I'm on the IRST. I'm a geologist at the University of Oregon and work with the Center for Biological Diversity.
Thank you, Josh. Stacy?
Morning, Stacy Duttweiler. I'm the Oregon Policy Director at the Wild Salmon Center and also the co-chair of AMC with Seth.
Thanks, Stacy. Jason?
Good morning, Jason Robinson, Land and Resource Officer for the Cow Creek Umpqua Tribe and the LCIS Tribal Rep for AMC.
Thank you, Jason. Amy?
Morning, I'm Amy Price. I'm the biologist for the Elliott State Research Forest.
Thank you, Amy. Jessica?
Good morning. I'm Jessica Homiak. I'm a director of environmental research with Weyerhaeuser and a co-chair of the IRST.
And Rebecca.
Rebecca McCown, riparian and aquatic specialist with the ODF monitoring unit, just listening in.
Right, thanks to all of you. Did I miss anybody in the room or virtually? Okay, Terry, I've confirmed we do have a quorum for the IRST. Do we have a quorum for AMC?
Yes, all the AMPC, for the record, all the AMPC members are here. We're going to skip the roll call for today. Since for the record, everyone's here.
All right.
Either virtually or.
Great. Any updates on AMP related work that Terry or any of the others want to share? Kelly, Jessica, Seth, Stacy, Terry. Any updates you'd like to share? Nope.
Nope.
Okay, good. And I understand you allow for public comment generally for AMC meetings at the start of the meeting.
Yep.
Is there anyone that wishes to make public comment? The public comment period is open. The public comment period is closed. Okay. We are on time. It's 10:10. On the agenda 10:08 in reality. So we will get started with a presentation on the HCP biological goals and objectives. Jennifer Weichel, the HCP coordinator, will be up to present it. Thank you, Jennifer, for doing that.
Where do you want me to?
You know, wherever you want.
For audio for people.
I think they can hear you wherever you are in the room. So if you want to stand, if you want to sit, if you want to drive, you want me to drive, whatever.
I'll sit and drive,
Okay.
stand if I need to get up.
Okay. These are both.
Okay. All right, thanks everybody for having me. I'm the coordinator for the Private Forest Accord HCP project. And I'm looking forward to chatting with you a little bit about the biological goals and objectives and the effectiveness monitoring program as it's described in the HCP as currently drafted. So you guys all should have had in your packages that was sent out, I believe it was sent out a while ago and then just recently, the biological goals and objectives from our conservation strategy chapter in their entirety. But that's the only part of that chapter that was shared. And then also the entirety of chapter 6, which is our monitoring chapter. So that's mostly what I'm going to be talking about is what's in those two pieces.
I'm trying to get this share actually. Maybe
Okay, I'll wait.
Let me, what's this?
Yeah, go for it.
And apologies, folks, the camera's not working in the room. So fortunately, you don't have to see my face, but you've got this wonderful PowerPoint. Let's see if it's going to play.
Thanks, Terry. It's working.
Hooray. But how do I, it's just,
Slideshow up top. I don't know.
no, it's not on the computer. So
It is, Terry.
no,
Are you
but no.
Let's see your presentation mode?
Yeah, I've seen presentation.
Okay.
Yep.
Oh,
You're
that's what's online?
Yes.
I mean, it's not like my notes are
Because
top secret, but,
Oh,
here is Scott. Yeah.
oh, interesting.
Oh.
Okay.
Well, you can just scroll, just,
Okay.
okay, all right, we're good. All right.
Sorry.
It's okay. So what I'm gonna cover, and we have like an hour and that's more than enough time, so there'll be plenty of time for conversation and discussion. But I'm gonna give a little bit of an overview of the HCP, kind of what it's about, where we're at in the process. Going to talk a little bit about the monitoring framework as a whole for the whole HCP, how the pieces fit together.
Okay, so we're having
Okay.
technical.
More technical.
So any,
So if you stop sharing.
share.
Do slideshow.
There we go.
You get it now. Yeah, it's gotta be the slideshow. Your turn.
So somebody else wants to like. That would be great. Yeah, so this is on that computer right now.
Okay, maybe we just stop sharing on that. Let's try it over here.
Get there. technology.
Yeah, it should be. It's what I'm saying. That should be it.
Okay.
Okay. There we go. I think it's.
All right, can everybody online see the PowerPoint? Okay, might know he's on your computer.
Yes.
Okay. Good job, team. I'm gonna sit down. It's just delayed. Okay, I think we're in business. It's just got a little lag. All right, so this is what I'm talking about today, HCP overview, monitoring framework, and then going into some details on the biological goals and objectives and how they relate to the pre-identified monitoring types. Okay, so some HCP basics. So this is just about HCPs in general, and also a little bit how it relates to our HCP. Things that are important to remember. So a HCP is a mechanism for compliance with the Endangered Species Act as specifically allowed under Section 10 of the Endangered Species Act. The HCP forms the basis of an agreement between an applicant and the federal services. And the federal services for our HCP, I will use the term services throughout, but really what I'm talking about is combined National Marine Fisheries Service and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And the applicant in our case is Oregon Department of Forestry. So the result of accepted HCP is ultimately issuance of incidental take permits for our covered species, which is the ultimate goal. Okay, some stuff about our HCP that's important to know. This is what's called a programmatic HCP. So it's not a simple, not our own land, not a single thing that we're covering. It's very large, very complex. So it covers multiple aquatic species of both fish and amphibians that fall under the jurisdiction of the two federal services. Anadromous fish are under National Marine Fisheries Service. And then the non-anadromous fish as well as amphibians fall under U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So we ultimately get two separate types of permits, one from each agency. Our HCP, this one is specifically tied to a regulatory framework, which is the Forest Practices Act, meaning that ODF's regulatory authority to implement the Forest Practices Act is the mechanism that will be implementing most of the HCP. Not discussed very often, but this HCP also involves two state agencies specifically with conservation measures under them. ODF, obviously, and then ODF&W has two conservation measures that relate to their work and their jurisdiction, that being the beaver strategy, and then also a component of the conservation, restoration, and benefit conservation measure, and that's mainly the PFA grant program. And then ultimately, the HCP applies to multiple covered parties. This HCP will apply to all private forest landowners in Oregon for small and large, as well as counties and municipalities that own and manage forest land under the jurisdiction of the NFPA. Okay, we mentioned this is just a slide a little bit about the mechanisms about how this works. So ODF has the agreement between ODF and the federal services. We hold the incidental take permits. And we also administer the Forest Practices Act that's under our jurisdiction. And then the regulatory assurances under those ITPs get passed down to the individual landowners. We are still working with the services on the details for that, but it appears that the most likely mechanism will be a certificate of inclusion that will be issued to landowners that are covered under the Forest Practices Act. Okay, this is an oversimplified slide. I am not super talented in PowerPoint and did not take the time to make one that fit my needs, but basically it serves the purposes for today. So the goals and objectives are essentially the center of the HCP. This is what we're trying to accomplish. So for the covered species that were, the goals and objectives describe what it is, like what is the heart of the PFA, what is the heart of the HCP that we're trying to achieve in relation to the covered species that are under our HCP, and then also in relation to the covered activities, which are the activities on the ground that are described in the HCP, mostly forest management activities. So the conservation strategy at the top there, that's what we're doing to implement. So this is the good things we're doing. These are mostly the changes to the Forest Practices Act regulations. The HCP implementation is how we're doing it. The monitoring, which is what we're talking about today, is how we're going to ensure that we are doing what we said we were going to do and that we're meeting our intended, that the conservation strategy itself is meeting the intended purpose as described in those goals and objectives. And then lastly, the adaptive management is the mechanism for how change and response to change is considered and achieved ultimately. Okay, this is a detailed slide about the timeline, which I'm not actually going to spend a lot of time on. The point of this slide, to just cut to the chase, is to mention that this HCP is still very much under development. And all the stuff that I said that we share with you could possibly change as we continue our discussions with the services. So the green bar on the top is work that ODF is leading on development of the HCP. There are some other things that happen to the left there that are already chopped off the graph because we've already accomplished them. But essentially in December of last year, we submitted the latest version of the HCP along with our application for incidental take permits. It is currently sitting on the desk of the services. And we're starting to work with at least National Marine Fisheries Service to dialogue and get some information on kind of where their remaining questions and concerns are. Ultimately, that will lead to development of yet another draft, which will be the public draft, which will then go out for public comment, and then again, another draft. So we are not done yet. The two lines in blue there, that's the work of the federal services. That's the NEPA process for development of an environmental impact statement, and then a biological opinion, which ultimately leads to incidental take permits. And so I'm not going to talk about those today, but just be aware that those processes will occur kind of in parallel with this. Okay. All right, now on to the details. So the focus of what I want to talk about for the rest of the time is the work under the Adaptive Management Program through your two committees, focusing mostly on the biological goals and objectives, and then talking a little bit about where we go from here with the effectiveness monitoring strategy. So I'm going to start here. This is the a cropped image of what's in the very first part of Chapter 6, which describes the monitoring as a whole. And I apologize to those online, but I'm just going to stand up here and kind of talk about it. So the monitoring framework, that's like monitoring as a whole, right? So just think of it holistically, not very specifically. There's two types of monitoring under this HCP that are separate and distinct. You have implementation monitoring, and then you have effectiveness monitoring. And then under effectiveness monitoring, we break out two types of monitoring that are also separate but combined a little bit. Status and trend monitoring and targeted monitoring studies. So all of this combined is effectiveness monitoring, separate than implementation. The other thing that's important to note on this graphic is that there is some cases where implementation monitoring directly informs effectiveness monitoring. It's a one-way arrow, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. So,
Hey, Jennifer.
yeah,
So implementation monitoring, to be clear, is compliance monitoring.
I'm going to talk about that. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So you're going to get a lot about compliance.
They're just.
Yeah. Okay, so here's the two questions we're trying to answer with the monitoring program. So the first one is to what degree the conservation measures are being implemented on the landscape. So that's how are we doing? Are we doing what we said we're going to do in the HCP? Are we meeting basically our obligations to the agreement with the services, implement this stuff on the ground? So this is implementation monitoring, which has two components, which I'm going to talk about, I think, in the next slide. And then Emily's going to talk about part of this at length. It's enforcement tracking and compliance monitoring. They're very different, but complement each other, and they combined relate to implementation monitoring. So the enforcement tracking, if you think of it as a continual flow of information, we're just going to be looking at what's happening on the ground for our normal business and tracking where we're starting to see signals and any kind of issues that are popping up. We're really just looking at the bad stuff happening with enforcement tracking. So it's not a statistically valid sample, not reflective of compliance as a whole in the landscape. And that's why you have the compliance monitoring program, which does that. And I'm not going to talk about that because Emily's talking about that at length. And then the effectiveness monitoring answers the question of how effective are the conservation measures at making progress towards our biological goals and objectives. So one is saying, are we doing what we said we were going to do? The other one is saying, is what we're doing achieving what we think it's supposed to be, is achieving what's supposed to be achieving? Okay, so this is a very condensed version of the primary goal statement, and there's one in we're going to talk about how these BGOs are structured here in a minute. This is what the PFA is about. This is what we're trying to achieve: cool, clean, connected, and complex habitats for recovered species. So if you look through that list of BGOs, you'll see it's structured. I can't remember how many there are. There are like 14 different groups. But if you look, they're separated specifically. There's a group of Western Oregon goals and objectives, and another set for Eastern Oregon. Some of them are basically duplicative, but it's set up that way on purpose because your species are different, west versus east. Your geography is different, your forest types are different, and then the rules are different. So we have special rules for east side for RMA buffers, for example. So they're separated, and then they're separated or described by species groups. So like objective 1 relates to all of the species combined, and all of the others, if you look, they're either talking about fish or amphibians. And then each objective, specifically the sub-objectives, are tied to specific conservation measures or things that are happening on the ground, which relate to our rules. And then each of them also have a pre-identified type of monitoring for tracking effectiveness in them. Okay, one other thing I want to mention about the BGOs that I think is important is that if you look at them, they're, with the exception of 5.9, which is a kind of out of place BGO that talks about amphibian monitoring. That's the priority amphibian monitoring stuff that you guys have already been working on. They all relate to habitat and components of habitat. So this is a habitat conservation plan, focus on the word habitat. So it's not tied, none of those objectives are tied to species populations, reproductive fitness, or other aspects of genetic diversity. And why is it important? Because we are not, this HTP is not about, like, or we're not tying this HTP's success to numbers of animals, because that is not a realistic goal for us. This is all tied to habitat. That's what ODF has influence and control over, is the habitat, the forest, what happens on the ground, not the species themselves. And our ITPs, our incidental take permits, are also likely to be tied to habitat, not a certain number of allowable take of species. With the one exception being, we probably will get an ITP for a number of individuals specifically related to animal handling, for like fish salvage for culvert stream crossing work. So just important to remember, this is a habitat conservation plan. What's not to say you can't have animal component to it, but the focus is habitat. Go ahead, Wendy.
What's an ITP? Again,
Incidental take permit. Yeah, thank you for asking. Okay, so I want to deep dive a little bit into how these goals, objectives and sub-objectives are structured, just so that you can understand, because they're going to really form the basis of a lot of work for this committee. So as I mentioned, there's an overarching biological goal for one for Western, one for Eastern. Under that, there's a series of objective statements, and I need my notes for that. Forget what I meant to say in the slide. So the objectives describe, what is it we're trying to achieve to meet the overarching goal. And so they describe, as I mentioned, there's by species. So this one is all the covered species combined. And this objective one is specifically talking about minimizing sediment delivery to streams. So it's a little bit more detailed than the goal, not super detailed. And then your sub-objectives break it down even further. So this 1.1 is again talking about minimizing sediment delivery, but it's specific to the no harvest RMAs on fish-bearing streams and large and medium non-fish-bearing streams. So they kind of tear down in the level of detail as you go. And then you'll see, like right now, I'm going to talk about the monitoring groups in detail. This one's actually not the best example to kick this off, but each of them have each sub-objective. So 1.1 here has a group identified for monitoring. So there's groups 1, 2, 3, and 4. And group 1 is the implementation monitoring. Two things to note on this. So again, that's the implementation monitoring program is separate from effectiveness monitoring under ODF management. But every single one of these VGOs gets this. So don't be confused that some of them say group 1 and don't have other stuff. Or if you see somewhere else where it gets confusing, because we call it group 1, but really everything's going to get it, because the conservation measures via the rules over time will all get implementation monitoring over time. Okay, so I'm going to talk later about this group 1 only. Some of them do only get implementation, and that's where it gets tricky. The ones that only get implementation monitoring are essentially those strategies that we have the best solid science behind them. So we believe that they're going to be effective just based on implementation. The group 2, these are status and trend monitoring sub-objectives. And these were identified, these are the conservation measures that address chronic processes, and chronic means just stuff happening on the landscape all the time, not episodic. And then these ones they were given group 2 because they're relatively simple, but there's some gaps in the literature. So there's a little bit more uncertainty. And then group 3, these are targeted monitoring studies. So these are conservation measures where there's clear gaps that need to be filled in. And so these are going to be for targeted studies. And then group 4 is exactly the same in that it's a targeted study, but these relate specifically to episodic events like landslides or major rainstorms that could cause sediment delivery to streams. And these are separated out because it was recognized early on that these are going to need a very different kind of study design and mechanism for monitoring. So we separated them out. Okay. A little bit on this group one only. So what this is, there's, as you see here, 1.1 and 4.2, it says group one implementation monitoring at the end, and then there's nothing else. All the other BGOs have a second type of monitoring identified. These are ones where the intent is to only do implementation monitoring. Looking at my notes. So these are the ones where there's, they were given this category. If there's a robust body of information to indicate that if they're implemented properly, they will be effective. So I do want to mention here, you know, we have started some conversations with the services, and these have been flagged as an issue. So this is one spot, just as a heads up, that things could change over time. I don't have anything solid to give you on that right now as far as what that might look like, but I'm just flagging that this particular group one only category could change. If it does change, it would mean that these would get assigned to some other secondary type of monitoring. I'm sorry, the two that I show here on the screen, the first one here is 1.1 that we've already talked about with the no harvest RMAs and sediment. And essentially the science shows like 30 to 50 feet of a no harvest buffer is adequate at keeping sediment out of streams. And our no harvest buffers are for the most part 100 feet plus. So high confidence that they're going to be effective at minimizing sediment. The other one shown here relates to stream crossings and fish passage. And this one in particular, we are assuming that if the fish culverts or passage structures go in as intended and they meet the rules, meaning they meet all of those specs, they're supposed to pass fish. So if they meet those specs, we're assuming they're going to pass fish. Okay, moving on. So group two, this is our examples for the status and trend monitoring. So these are the ones where we'd be looking at status trend monitoring over time and thinking about whether that trend is going in the right direction at the right trajectory to either maintain or trend towards a specific goal. So the first one here has to do with maintaining shade to support stream temperature for covered fish, and then looking at no harvest RMAs on small non-fish bearing perennial streams. So these are the NP buffers. So this is a brand new rule for Oregon. So there's a little bit of uncertainty on effectiveness. So it's given the status and trend category. Let's track the stream temperature in these NP buffers and see if we're on target, basically. The second one and the 1.7 and 1.8 both relate to hydrological disconnection of roads to streams. And the first one is FRIA program, and the second one is the specific rule relating to hydrological disconnection. So these are both given status and trend monitoring categories. So one of the things I want to mention in the HCP, what you'll notice is that the trend targets are not identified in the document as drafted, nor are the thresholds where action would need to be taken. That is work still to be done, and I believe that falls under these two committees of what you're talking about today. But the idea is that if we're tracking status and trend monitoring over time and you realize you're failing to meet the desired target, it then triggers the adaptive management process to reevaluate. That reevaluation could take many different forms. I'm not saying anything new. It's described in statute and rule. It could include additional study being recommended, moving to a new monitoring group. That would sort of be like a group 2 could be moved to a group 3. And then obviously rulemaking, guidance, all the stuff that's in statute and rule. would be on par as well. Okay. Group 3, these are your targeted studies. So this is where we have some gaps in the science. The 2 I have shown are, again, 2 brand new rules for Oregon. One is the new requirement for RELZs on those perennial streams, the non-fish perennial above the forested buffer, and amphibians. So we're, the goal, the sub-objective here is that those RELZs will maintain shade to support those animals, something we need to look at. So that's a targeted study. The 11.1 relates to our new RMA extension for seep springs and wetlands. And 11.1 specifically relates to connectivity for fish. So those are just 2 examples for those. And then lastly, the targeted monitoring studies after triggering events. The 2 examples here I've got shown, one relates to the steep slope strategies, which are the slope retention areas. Whether they are slope retention areas minimize episodic sediment delivery to fish bringing streams to support the need of covered species throughout the permit term. So that's looking at SRAs and sediments. And then 1.11 is looking at episodic sediment delivery from roads. So that would be, again, more like a large rain event or something that's causing an episodic flush, potentially, of sediment. So are our rules doing what we think they're going to do to avoid that from happening? That is set up for a targeted study after a triggering event. Okay, almost done. So why do we need an effectiveness monitoring strategy? So in the HCP, it currently states that the committees will develop an effectiveness monitoring strategy for the HCP to be developed within a year of ITP issuance. So as I mentioned, this HCP is just gargantuan and complex. And there's a lot of BGOs and a lot of sub-objectives if you spend the time to look through them all. There's a lot to track, and I think that we need, information on like, how are we going to accomplish that? The services are going to want to know when we submit this document that we have a plan in place to accomplish all of this monitoring within that 50-year permit term. So how are we going to accomplish it? What is the priority scheme? And there was another one that I'm forgetting. Yeah, how will things be prioritized, and then generally what type of monitoring will be done? So still, as I mentioned, we're still working with the services. And so some of those details on what they're actually going to require to in the HCP may vary over time. But right now, what we have is what you have in your document that states that the committees will do this work, and we'll have something within a year of ITP issuance. So again, just back to the timeline, just regardless of whether it's a year after ITP issuance or we hear something else that some of this detail needs to go in the HCP, I just personally feel like this is really important work you're about ready to take on. This is going to be important to our programs as a whole, for our agency, whether it goes in the HCP or not, it doesn't matter. This is really important and challenging work. You look at a BGO list and it's a bit daunting, but I think that there are strides that can happen to move this forward pretty quickly by just sort of chunking through it and thinking about a reasonable way to prioritize and bin those. But time is of the essence, because if we stay on track, we would be getting ATPs December 2027. So this would be due end of 2028. I think that's my last slide. Okay, that was my last slide. Questions, discussion? Yeah, Josh.
So The VGOs will say things like, adequate shade, or minimizing sediment delivery for the sediment, for the detention areas on steep slopes. So for those kinds of terms, adequate, are the services asking for those to be translated into numerical metrics?
They will. So that's in, if, as you guys embark on this work, you may want to take the time to have your HCC handbook handy too, just to see what they say in there for requirements. But that's, feel free. That's what, when I talk about possibly needing to understand what the, what is the target? What is it we're measuring? And what is the target? That's where that would come in. So where it says minimize shade, well, what does that mean? What is the target for what is minimized shade? And then for temperature, what is your target for temperature? And then if it's a trend, if it's a status and trend, what is the trend that we're looking for? Are we looking to stay under a certain trend or march towards a certain trend? They're going to want that kind of information. At least that's what I'm being told.
Yeah.
Jennifer, David has a question.
Yeah. Hi, David.
Hi, thank you. Well done, excellent job. Question I have that still confuses me, and maybe you could help me out a little bit as it relates to this, and kind of, piggybacks on what Josh was saying, is with regards to how TMDL for stream temperature is integrated into this, if at all. I mean, with ODF's efforts to, satisfy DEQ's requirements, and will that play into any modifications or quantification of what we're trying to do here?
It's a great question, and I'm just gonna say what I know. I'm not 100% confident on my answer, but it's my understanding that is a completely separate project and completely separate from our HCP. So we should be looking at the HCP, independent of that. So looking at these goals and objectives and meeting them independent of that. The only place where things do come in that I've been told, and it's actually in the documents, like those 303D listed streams, that is brought into consideration. There may be special considerations to take in mind with regards to determining what trends and targets might be if a system is in one of those 303D listed versus not, or a particular fish, I should say, with a particular fish population overlaps with those 303D streams.
Haley, then Stacy.
Oh, I was curious about the time frame that services are gonna want those threshold values, like in that.
We don't really know yet.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we're dialoguing with right now it's in the document as that work would be due within a year after ITP issuance. We're seeking some clarification on whether that is acceptable or not. I don't have an answer at this point. Yeah, so
they might issue the incidental take permit, or it sounds like they would, and then we could define threshold.
it's currently in the document. It says that basically the effectiveness monitoring strategy is due within a year. So the short answer to your question is I don't know yet.
Okay.
I may be back to you at your next meeting or sometime saying, hey, by the way, things changed. This stuff needs to go in the document, but at this point, I don't know for sure. We're still working out the details. Yeah, they have signaled that they might be asking for that, but we don't know the things for sure yet.
Stacy.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer, for the presentation. Super helpful. And I just wanted to add on a little bit to Josh's question and kind of Dave and Haley's questions, which is spot on, asking about the metrics and the trend targets. And I just copied from the HCP that language in there that Jennifer was kind of speaking to, but the process that is in the HCP that we've sort of collectively proposed to the services is that AMSI will basically send that to IRST to develop those metrics and trend targets. And there are some metrics with some language included, and that's sort of the first step that IRST would then develop those. And there is a timeline that we've proposed around that, all with the caveat, like Jennifer's been saying, that the services might come back and say, you know, you need to do this a different way or change this timeline. So that's what the state's proposed. I don't know if that's helpful, but page 6-22 in the HCP kind of digs into that if folks haven't had a chance to look at it.
Yeah, one thing just to mention really quickly, if you look at that section of HCP that talks about effectiveness monitoring strategy, you'll notice that status and trend monitoring has a lot of information in it. And that's because we had some information to get started, right? So that's got some details about what it is we think we might be tracking. So that section has a head start. The section on the targeted studies for groups 3s and 4s does not have a lot of details. It does mention 2 types of projects that are pre-identified for study. One is the PPAP monitoring. The other one is the steep slope validation. But just because that section is silent doesn't mean that work doesn't have to happen. So that is the trend or what it is we're going to be looking at. What is the targets? What is it that we're aiming towards achieve in those group 3s and 4s also needs to be thought about. They're just because the document's silent doesn't mean it's not. Terry, you
Just about the whole metrics and trend targets. Is it possible? I looked at the Elliott State Forest HCP, and what it has is not overly specific.
Right.
And so there's even a range of the line in the sand is this black and white line to this line in the sand is this 2-foot wide fuzzy thing. I mean, is that?
No, that's very fair. Yeah, I'm glad you actually asked that. So did that go out in the materials or not?
No.
Okay. Well, Elliott HCP's out. You can go look at it. I think it's in their monitoring chapter. Yeah, it's finalized. It's a good example. So these trend targets don't have to be numeric necessarily. Like it doesn't have to say X. Like, for example, like large wood recruitment. It doesn't have to be X numbers of pieces of wood per mile of stream. If you look at what's in the Elliott and it mirrors from what I've at least seen for that State Forest is working towards, the large wood one would say like maintain a desired level of something very qualitative, not quantitative. So it doesn't have to be quantitative metric. So definitely worth time to go look at some other approved HCPs out there to see what it is. Because I could easily see like deep diving and getting into the weeds, trying to come up with numeric things, when really what we might need is just like, what is the direction we're heading and what is it roughly we're trying to achieve? Some things may need numerics. I'm not discounting that. Some things, where we have solid science, there's good information, there may be a reason for numeric thresholds, but it doesn't have to be. So look at the Elliott as an example. That HCP, you have to be careful when comparing it because it's so different. It's a land base, NOAA land base, much less complex, I should say. But it's just a good thing to look at because it's our only other Oregon forest HCP that's approved.
Jennifer, are there any other places where there's this large a footprint on an HCP that could serve as a model, even if it's outside of Oregon?
Yeah, Washington obviously is the most appropriate example. So our HCP is developed to mirror what's already going on in Washington for the forest and fish. So looking at theirs as a model. And we've looked long and hard for others similar. There are other large scale HCPs further back east, but they're not regulatory in nature. But again, they could serve as an example. And Kate and I could pull up a list of HCPs for the committee if they would like to know where to go look for similar examples.
Any other questions or comments? Yeah, Kelly.
Yeah, excuse me. I'm going to weave a couple of things here together. There is the one numeric metric. So there is a metric for temperature, and it's the biological based numeric criteria for fish. for salmonids. So that is an example of a target that is included in the HCP.
Right.
But the HCP was not designed to obtain Clean Water Act assurances. So the whole TMDL issue is outside of the purview of the HCP. And so that's how that comes into play. And I think that's all I wanted to say.
Thanks for that clarification.
Other questions? Yep, Sean.
One of your examples was on the road sediment, and one of the sub goals said FRIA, according to FRIA, and then the other one said according to other road rules.
Yeah.
Does that mean we should be trying to set up effectiveness monitoring to say what's FRIA doing versus?
That one, I think maybe, I think we need to think about that one, the FRIA one. The FRIA one is interesting because I think when I think of FRIA, what is tracked there is are the projects are we achieving our goals for FRIA? Like, are the projects being done on the ground, right? So that's actually more implementation than actual effectiveness. And then the effectiveness monitoring, I think of as more holistically, like with the other road rule one of like, okay, well, assuming we're getting, so the other disconnection rules for disconnection of the road from the stream, like it seems like that would make more sense to look at status and trend and targeted monitoring where it's identified. And so that's something, the BGOs, I don't know that they're going to change, but there's some things like that as they've been sitting for a while, I look back at them, I'm like, okay, what would that really mean? Status and trend monitoring for FRIA.
And the good news, Sean, is we've already got a jump start on the status and trends for road sediment. So
yeah,
I don't think.
Other questions, comments?
Sure, I'll add that, I remember early on in some of these conversations that we've had, even right on the heels of the private forest accord, this program as a whole, the adaptive management program as a whole, both of these committees and all of this, there was some initial conversation with some of the members of the federal agencies that were overwhelmed by the magnitude of what we were organizing within this the adaptive management program. And I think it's useful to couch this correctly that like the Elliott, for example, there's no AMC and IRST for the Elliott HCP, right? This entity that we're involved in is much bigger than any other besides the Washington example, the Forest and Fish. And it's because it covers an entire program, right? And so there's just a lot to wrap your arms around there with regards, like you're saying, that the vast complexities around Eastern Oregon, small forest landowners, Southern Oregon, Western Oregon, all of the complexities that are involved in all of this, and the fact that it's covering the entire program, not just the suite of new rules that were implemented, but the entire program. And so I think that a lot of what we will ultimately describe in our effectiveness monitoring strategy will be a lot of the processes that we're involved in. I don't think we necessarily have to have everything nailed down altogether. Here's exactly what our priorities will be every year from now till year 50 or 75 or whatever. It'll be more, here's how we're doing this, here's how the communities work together to prioritize topics, and here's the processes in play. Some of the things will be more nailed down than others, but I think that's important direction as well. You don't have to have it all like mapped out exactly how it's all going to happen.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't think the services are necessarily going to need a map from year 1 to 50 of what studies are going to be done when. But what they are going to want to know is that we have things in place so that we, from between year 1 and 50, that we can accomplish all of that.
And so kind of piggybacking on that. So for example, the status and trend monitoring strategy, I mean, I'm trying to wrap my head around what degree of complexity, and I know you may not know the answer, but I'm just putting the question out, because you could do a 2-page strategy that is very hand wavy. You could do a 100-page, very detailed, this is the cost, this is exactly where and when and how of everything. So somewhere in there is probably what at least the services are looking for eventually. But any guess on that complexity and how detailed or anything?
I don't know yet.
Yeah.
I'm guessing there's a middle ground.
Yeah.
And really what again, like looking to other HCPs to see what's been successful, our best gauge of what they may be looking for.
Gotcha.
So I'm just trying to square in my head previous conversations we've had, and Jennifer, what you talked about at the onset, which is around the fact that the BGOs are structured, and this is all related to habitat, it's a habitat conservation plan, but there's many BGOs that talk about the needs of the covered species. And, we've had these conversations about, do we include in the study designs, looking at habitat and the effect to the populations. You've had discussions about the inclusion of genetics and diversity and things like that. So I'm trying to kind of square around effectiveness monitoring what, in this conversation around the thresholds, where we do, where we don't, where it's appropriate to tie those things together, because it seems like the assumption is here, which is, I think, important to remember, that these conservation measures are effective, right? And they warrant the issuance of an incidental state. And so, in so much as we are effective in implementing, I guess it helped me better understand where the effectiveness monitoring program fits in around the needs of the species and the assumptions of the services.
That's a great question. And Terry and I have talked about this bit over the last few months, but just the way I think about it is, so I did also talk to my contractor about this to make sure I wasn't like way off base, but it's a habitat conservation plan. So taking, for example, salmonids, we have a pretty solid, we don't know everything about salmon, but we have a pretty solid knowledge of what their habitat needs are. And that's what the BGOs for fish are structured for, right? So clean water, sediment, minimizing sediment, the complexity in the stream, all of that. That knowledge base is pretty solid. And so tracking the habitat is very appropriate. That's what, again, we have control over, is maintaining all of those things that lead up to successful population. I think where animal sampling has a role in this HCP is where we have that gap in knowledge. So for example, I haven't deep dove into the science on the amphibians in a while, but I think there's a stronger gap in our science of understanding exactly what our habitat components are, especially for the torrent salamanders. So that is where you could have a combo approach of doing a study that, yes, we're trying to track what's in the BGOs for the components of habitat, cool water, all the same things, but also have some animal sampling to go with it to gain the knowledge of that connection of the animal, the habitat at the same time. So you're sort of filling a knowledge gap simultaneous to while you're tracking some of those habitat components. If that makes sense. But I would question, and I know Jessica's on, he wants to weigh in, but I would question whether we have the knowledge base to do a study to track population trends in salamanders right now. I don't know that we have that knowledge base. So tracking the habitat makes sense, and then getting more knowledge on what that connection is.
And that makes sense. I appreciate that. Sometimes I just wonder, and maybe I shouldn't do that all the time. Sometimes I just wonder, what is our responsibility versus the services responsibility to have competence, right? And so, anyways, it's a collaborative effort, right? We're all in it for the same objectives, right? We want to see these species survive, and we want to be able to do the operations. that
If
we
you,
need to do
if
as
you
well.
think about it, you flip it around and flip it the other way, think about, like, if we were to be given incidental take permits for numbers of animals, we could very quickly get ourselves crosswise. So for example, with the salmon, we don't want an incidental take permit that says we can only take X number of salmon, because there are other things out there in the environment affecting that species that are completely out of our control. So that's why, like the habitat conservation plan, that's why we're focusing on the habitat. The same could probably be said for the amphibians, although it's a little different because they're obviously dwarf. Resident trout and amphibians are not going out into the ocean. There's still other factors that affect them.
And private and state land are not responsible for covering under ESA either, so it wouldn't make sense.
Yeah.
For any reason. Thank you.
Yeah.
Taryn?
I think Wendy might have.
Yeah, I was thinking about the same thing. And just to see if I'm understanding this right, like when we look at those, the description of monitoring groups, right? It seems to me like in certain of those, like say more groups 1 and 2, or assuming if a conservation measure is taken because there's knowledge about the species, you could basically presume that it will have a positive impact that might meet the needs based on scientific literature. But then we look at group 3, the targeted monitoring studies. Those are areas where there are knowledge gaps.
There's knowledge gaps.
Yeah.
You still have
And
an
therefore we
assumption
can't-
that what were put in place will be effective.
Yeah, so you can't presume exactly that the measure taking effect is going to meet the needs of the species. And then in the BGO, it uses the, say, maintain for amphibians, maintaining connectivity to support the needs of the amphibian species. So to me, it seems like the reason you have group 3 targeted monitoring studies is to, in a situation where there are gaps, to make sure that if that habitat condition is achieved, if that's actually meeting the needs of the amphibious species. Does that sound sort of right to you?
I think that jives with what you're saying. Yeah. Yeah. I think it depends on which specific BGO you're looking at, but
Yeah, well, I was looking at the ones like on page 4-9. Yeah, actually 4-8. Where it's just talking about objective 5, the one that has to do with connectivity support, the needs of amphibian species, because it seems to relate to the questions we've been working on and what exactly that you're talking about. Well, everyone looks puzzled, but is that making sense? That's how I was personally thinking about the relationship between the targeted monitoring studies when they're called for.
yeah, it depends on which one you're looking at, but connectivity could mean connectivity for animals moving it, so yes, that would then reasonably logic, maybe you'd be looking at the animal. It could also just be connectivity of hydrology. Making sure you don't have gaps in your hydrology for particularly, if your torrent system breach. So it could be habitat as well. No big gaps in your habitat for the animals so that they are not able to move along the stream system. So it could be both.
But it focuses on the needs of the species.
Needs of species.
As established by targeted studies.
As established by our knowledge base as well as, whatever it is you're monitoring.
And just to hit on this point about studying species, so I think what I'm hearing is there's studying the species to get a better understanding of their habitat needs, and then they're studying species like how many are there? And what I'm hearing is that question, and there's obviously much more nuance to how many are there, but I'm using that as shorthand for all these things. That's sort of not really a goal in and of itself. And how could you compare it to the BGOs?
Yeah.
How could you compare success?
Not appropriate goal, which we don't have in here, would be, we're not saying ODF is going to maintain a trajectory of torrent salamander population trends below, 2.1% loss per year. Like, we can't do that. We don't have the knowledge base, nor would that be an appropriate goal. We're managing the habitat, not the animals.
Okay.
Other questions or comments? Okay, thank you very much.
I'm around those.
Oh, great, Seth, we've got some.
I guess the last thing I would say is something you alluded to. I just think it's important for us to couching this correctly is that the assumption of the authors when we wrote the adaptive management program, when we wrote the private forest accord that went into this HCP application is that the protection measures that are put in place are adequate for the protection of these species.
Right.
Otherwise, we would not be applying for an incidental take permit.
Right.
That is the assumption. And there was give and take in that. And I think everybody around that table recognizes where those were, right? But the knowledge wasn't perfect in some of these areas. And so I think those are the areas where it's useful to have these tier 3s to understand more. But the premise was that based on the information that we do have, these measures are protective for the species, and we are requesting that the services give us an incidental take permit because of that. And so, anyway, that's, I think, an important point.
Yeah, thanks for that, Seth. Wendy, is your hand still raised or was that? Oh,
sorry.
So Jennifer, thank you for that great work. If everybody promises to get back, let's take a 7-minute stretch break and we'll fire up your program, Emily. So 7-minute stretch break, 11:15. All right. So you already go. Nice job.
Oh.
All right.
Yep, I got it up.
Hey.
It's a struggle. Yeah.
That's okay. Conversation goes like this.
Oh, yeah, good.
Yeah. I'm looking at that list of things to be monitored.
I need to check in.
I was like, no.
And that's a
There was some changes.
Oh, yeah.
Right. I saw it on the, it's his house. Last night or whatever, but yeah.
It's like there's. You know anything about it? It's good. It's just, yeah. It's just good. It's good. There's. Good. So.
That's shorthand for category 5.
Okay, that's why I need to check. I mean, I can just do something about the size. Okay.
Category 1. What exists?
I need to.
Grades and grades.
So thanks, Tyler.
Which is everything you did.
Oh, no. Mainly, I'm just, yeah. I would kind of like.
So.
I can't say anything on it.
Category 5.
And that's so curious.
Yeah, but the timing seems. I'm working on that. Yeah, so yeah, we kind of need to coordinate that.
No, that's great.
3 grades.
It's impaired.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I don't think
So in order to use trades,
Yeah.
Yeah, I think. What's going on? Yeah.
Not here, this is our time. The monitoring. It's not. So just do these things.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's just like a
Yeah.
It's
11:15.
Have a seat, folks. You need to do this.
Here we go, 11:15.
There's no reason.
All right, we are shifting gears to compliance monitoring, and with us is Emily Martin of ODF. Take it away, Emily.
Thank you so much. Okay, so Jennifer, Michael did a really good job setting the stage for this presentation. You're going to see a little bit of overlap here for context, but I'm going to be explaining how our compliance monitoring program interfaces with the Habitat Conservation Plan. All right, so what I'll be covering is first providing an overview of our compliance monitoring program, and then its role in the HCP. And then I'm going to be giving a kind of like overview of our compliance monitoring studies that are currently in the works. Okay, so this is taken straight out of the Forest Practices Act rules for the purposes and goals of our compliance monitoring program. Essentially, we monitor our rule implementation and analyze our compliance rates. Then we report our findings, and then we apply that information for education and outreach to improve training and help with targeted enforcement. with the goal of increasing the public's trust in implementation of the FPA and its rules. All right, so since the private forest accord and the FPA got kind of it got kind of anyway. Since it kind of got edited and changed a little bit recently, the CMP has been given some rule priorities. So that kind of guides where our projects are. So we were told to look at vegetation along streams, road construction and maintenance, and harvesting on steep slopes, and then other rules as directed by the Board of Forestry. Okay, so just a little bit of background on who does what. So, we have our implementation monitoring, which Jennifer, talked about a bit, and that's our enforcement and our compliance monitoring. So again, our compliance monitoring is assessing those compliance rates with forest practice rules. This is a statewide kind of program. So we look at statistical studies on that scale, and there's no enforcement involved. And then we're using that again to inform our education and outreach and improve on that compliance level for those rules. And then our stewardship foresters, we often work with them to help us gain access to land for our studies. So they're really helpful. And, they're the ones that are doing those site-specific inspections and enforcement, and they focus on high-risk operations and provide technical assistance to our landowners. And then outside of implementation monitoring, when you get over to the effectiveness monitoring, a lot of you are involved in that, the AMC, IRST, evaluating if rules achieve the BGOs and the HCP, and it informs rule changes and guidance updates. All right, so now moving on to where we fit in HCP. Okay, so just a little bit looking at our HCP elements. Of course, we have our covered species, covered activities. We have our biological goals and objectives, conservation measures, monitoring and adaptive management, and the annual reporting to the services. So more specifically here, we're looking at how compliance monitoring relates to biological goals and objectives. So the overarching goal, which saw a similar version of this slide earlier with Jennifer, but it's to create cool, clean, connected, and complex habitats, well maintained, I should say, for covered species. Something that, some way that I look at it and how this feeds, compliance monitoring feeds into it, and the rules that we focus on is our riparians, roads, and steep slope rules, directly impact things like stream shade, i.e. our riparian buffers, and sediment delivery to roads, i.e. retention of vegetation along steep slopes and water crossing requirements on roads, something that we've been looking at with our projects, and something that I will cover in greater detail later. Okay, so again, another slide you may be familiar with now. So our two key questions are, to what degree are conservation measures being implemented on the landscape, our implementation monitoring, enforcement, and compliance monitoring, and then how effective it is, which for meeting our BGOs, and that's adaptive management. All right, so specifically, our role in the HCP is to evaluate overall implementation on the landscape, identify our areas that need improvement, report the results to the Board of Forestry, and contribute key information for our adaptive management program and our HCP annual reports to services. So one way to look at how effectiveness monitoring and implementation kind of monitoring help each other out is the implementation monitoring provides context. In that it's good to know to what degree compliance is occurring with our rules that we're checking effectiveness on. So it's just a nice way to contextualize that effectiveness. Okay, so again, this is something taken directly out of the HCP section that you all have looked at, and just highlights where implementation monitoring falls. Again, implementation monitoring provides information for our effectiveness monitoring. And it's something, the services want to know, to what degree are these rules being followed on the landscape? And then how effective are those rules? It's not necessarily, something that has to happen for effectiveness monitoring to work, but it's helpful to have that kind of information about whether or not rules have high compliance rates. Okay, so a little bit of specific examples of BGOs that are supported by our different studies. I'm starting with the riparian study, but again, for brevity, I'm only including some examples. There are more BGOs outside of this slide and the others that I'll be looking at with our specific projects that are supported by the studies. So first off, application of our riparian study. Our rule set that we're looking at is Division 643, water protection rules, vegetation along streams. The BGO target is all fish-bearing streams and large and medium N-type streams. And that specifically looks at both our listed fish and amphibian species. And then for Western Oregon, the no harvest RMAs along target streams, the BGOs for that include things like minimize sediment delivery, maintain shade, maintain habitat connectivity for amphibians, and then maintain riparian function and complex habitats. And then for Eastern Oregon, a pertinent example is the goal of having tree retention along target streams to minimize sediment delivery. All right, some more examples for our road study, and I will be going over our studies in more detail later on in the presentation, but just looking at our Division 625, forest road construction and maintenance, and the BGO target that this kind of jives with is like all fish-bearing streams for the listed fish species in HCP. There's the same goal for both Western and Eastern Oregon here, and that's maintaining in-stream connectivity by requiring new and existing crossings to meet standards. All right, and then for our steep slope study, we are looking at Division 630, harvesting on steep slopes, and the BGO target is all streams for both fish and amphibian species listed in the HCP. The example I have here is for Western Oregon for the designated debris flow transversal areas, DDFTAs, and minimizing sediment debris. All right, so before I go into the specific studies, just wanted to give you guys a glimpse into how we put these studies together. All right, so first off, we start out with our rule selection because, we can't monitor every single rule under these sections. It's just not something that is possible, and some of them are more qualitative than others. And then we put together a pilot study and collect data. And during that pilot study, we work with our statistician to analyze the data, and there's a report. But the focus of these pilot studies is not actually on compliance rates. It's to make sure that our methods are sound for a larger full study later on. And then after that full study is implemented, then the education and outreach piece that I mentioned earlier. All right, so a bit of background and who helps us with our program. So, within ODF, we have our monitoring unit staff. We have the FPA field coordinators and other subject matter experts, such as, Jennifer Weichel and Kate Thompson back there. And then for our compliance monitoring program committee, some of you were actually part of this committee, so thank you very much for your help. It's a stakeholder advisory committee with representatives from state agencies, industry, conservation groups, et cetera. And then we have our external statistician, MHE, Mount Hood Environmental, that assists us with our study design and our data analysis. All right, so a little bit of background on our rule selection. Again, we have to decide which FPA rules can be translated into research questions for our studies. We prioritize rules because, again, it's not practical to monitor all of them, and we focus on rules that are most critical and feasible for monitoring. We had a lot of discussion with the CMPC during this time. Each rule is framed as a question and analyzed to determine its suitability for inclusion in our monitoring studies. So a lot of thought goes into what we choose to monitor. Okay, so now on to our current compliance monitoring studies. We have our three sets, our riparian rules, road rules, and steep slopes rules. We have an annual cycle that we've set up here where we start our planning in kind of winter time and then site selection in the spring. We have our landowner outreach in summertime, and then we have our data collection generally starting in September Then when we're done with data collection, whether that's in the winter or in the spring, depending on how long our season is, we send that data to our statistician, and then the next year we focus on the analysis and reporting. Right, so on to our riparian pilot study. Okay, so this is something that we recently finished, the pilot study aspect of it, but it focused on Division 643, water protection rules, vegetation along streams. The pilot study, again, is used to refine our methods for a larger scale study of our stream buffer rules. What we did in the study was measure riparian management area widths from the active channel to the last live tree, flagging, and first harvested tree. We used multiple measurements because, you know, sometimes there's not always a stump, or sometimes there's not always flagging. So it's just kind of beneficial to have multiple things to measure in that case. All right. So as I said before, we recently finished our pilot study. Next up is our full study. We're working with MHE to you know, look at our lessons learned, like how can we improve our methods before we do that large scale study, and then you know, determine if that's necessary, and we're reviewing the report that they're putting out for us. All right, and then something that you'll notice here is our roads and steep slopes pilot studies. They are separate pilot studies, but we do implement them in the same season. So it's like every other, it's riparian, roads and steep slopes, riparian, roads and steep slopes. I have something that I'll show you guys later that kind of puts that into context. But currently we are in the planning stages of these pilot studies. We've done some of our site selection. But anyway, so what we're looking at is our Division 625, forest road construction and maintenance, and Division 630, harvesting on steep slopes. Specifically for our roads, we're looking at our new and reconstructed water crossings, looking at both written plan and field measurements. And then we are looking at our critical roads locations, looking at written plans for that. And then for our harvesting on steep slopes, we're assessing both the completion of the written plan and also collecting field measurements along our designated debris flow transversal areas. Okay, so a little bit more background on our steep slopes pilot. So the areas that we look at are identified by slopes models as most likely to deliver debris flows to type F or SSBT streams. FPA rules require tree retention along these DDFTAs. And then we're looking at a written plan completion and then evaluating tree retention along those DDFTAs. Something that we did look into was the efficacy of remote sensing methods, but there was some concern about canopy coverage and accurately identifying harvests in debris flow areas. So boots on the ground for this one. Okay, just to give you kind of an idea of what we're looking at out in the field for our measurements. For the standard option along those DDFTAs, looking at 100% retention of trees within 25 feet of on either side of the flow. And then for our minimum option, it's the same except for it's for 50% of the area of the DDFTA. All right, now a little bit more about our roads pilot study. So we're looking at new and reconstructed water crossings such as bridges and culverts to allow us to obtain a comprehensive perspective on our water crossing implementation. We're reviewing written plans and then conducting field surveys. We are looking again at the frequency that road construction and reconstruction crosses critical locations. I'm not going to go into that more, but here's a little bit of kind of a visual on what we're looking at for our water crossings. We're going to be looking at our culverts, bridges, and our stream and stream bank measurements. And then we will be documenting it via photos as well. All right, so this is what I talked about earlier, just to give you guys an idea of how we are approaching these studies. We finished our riparian pilot study. We're now in the roads and steep slopes pilot study process. It'll switch off every other. And, every 2 years, we have reporting to the Board of Forestry. And then every 8 years, we have aggregate cumulative report of compliance trends. All right, questions?
Thank you. That was really helpful. One of the slides had a point on it about focus on rules most critical and feasible. And so I'm wondering what rubric you all use to determine critical and feasible. And then as a specific example, I was just curious how the DDFTAs rose to the surface when the slope retention areas didn't for those steep slopes rules.
Yeah, so for the first part of that, for the rubric, we go through all of the rules that apply to those sections that we were tasked with focusing on. And then what we do is for each one, we pose it as a question like we talked about. But if it's too qualitative, sometimes it's like, oh, to this street, they don't say how much sediment is a good amount or not. It's sometimes not possible to do a study on something that's too qualitative because it's not going to really provide us information on whether or not compliance is occurring or to what degree, because we don't have good metric for measuring it. And so we go over that as a team in compliance monitoring. And we also have our CMPC review all of those questions, and we make decisions together on what makes sense to be part of our study. And I guess for the second part of your question about the steep slopes, I'm actually going to turn that over to Adam, if that's all right.
Yeah, just to add to what Emily mentioned, we initially do that role selection. We include subject matter experts within the agency, and we bend them to kind of a like green, yellow, red, where green would be might be different colors, but it's very clear. There's a way to estimate compliance, yes or no. So there's typically some type of measurements that's very clear. Then there's some that are been into sort of this gray category, where you could come close to figuring out whether there's compliance, but it's not cut and dry. And then there's some that are just absolutely too vague. And Emily mentioned in the roads, one of the questions will include critical locations. And that is, in my mind, was kind of an initial test to include rules where it is somewhat vague. And for that specific rule, we're just initially starting out with a frequency count for the pilot study. So it's not through the lens of necessary compliance at the initial look. Steep slopes question, can you repeat that?
Yeah, you all decided to focus on the DDFTAs rather than the slope retention areas.
Yeah.
And
So
I'm just curious.
Just curious why. Yeah, I'd have to go back to, we'd be happy to share that rule selection document that would include some of the comments there, but you have to go back to that to understand why the FDA versus test areas.
And that one was just my own curiosity, but the other initial question was more about how you all sorted through all the rules, because IRST is going to be faced with that same exercise. So any help you all can give us in that regard?
Yeah, happy to.
Super valuable.
For the steep slopes, the written plan analysis will include, I think there's an SRA component to that, but the field component is DDFTAs, and that's, I can't recall if I know that there's a specific buffer with, I think, 25 feet from the active channel. So that's cut and dry measurement. I can't recall if it has a specific, like something where would be easily measurable, but that might be the reason why. I'd have to look though.
It would have to be measurable to be implemented though, right?
No, not necessarily. I mean, there's there's specific calls that stewardship foresters have to make in terms of enforcement, but if it's degradation of resources, that's a call that they make in the field. But I don't think it necessarily has to be like you're not out there with a tape measure necessarily just enforcing things that they can measure.
Depends on the component of the presence absence is an easy one to measure, right? Shape might be a little bit more difficult. But I would imagine SRAs are not off the table for monitoring in a future.
No, certainly not. So,
I mean, something to give us an example, but, is not something that's easy to monitor is sometimes there's things with steep slopes and after rainfall events, or roads. And it's not something that we can't determine where there's going to be heavy rainfall. And we have to select these sites in advance and get permission from the people to get onto their land. And we also have to work with stewardship foresters so they know we're coming. So a lot goes into this planning, and that does preclude some of those rules that we can look at because we can't just pop over there when it's time, so unfortunately.
Okay, we've got 5 questions. So virtual Josh, then Ellen, Seth, Rebecca, and in room Josh.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Go ahead, Josh.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Thanks for the presentation and the context. I had a question about the debris flow transversal areas. Just getting hip to the acronym here. And I'm also a strong advocate of boots on the ground, but I also see a lot of value in remote sensing and in particular LiDAR. And I guess I just wanted a little clarification on what the efficacy issues were. Was it defining these debris flow runout paths? Was it directing the field work and monitoring or excuse me, measuring the canopy? Where was the challenges? And the reason I bring this up is I've actually sort of had this full circle experience of being in the field with LiDAR and not being aware that there's a debris flow fan in front of me because it's covered in trees and realizing sort of just the power of it, but also there's nothing like being in the field as well, but there's sort of a balance of those two working together. And I'm just curious to hear more about what you the concern or the efficacy issues you were expressing.
Yeah, so I went back to that slide just to kind of help with the context. So I think, part of it was just like being able to find those free flow areas. It looks, I don't know if Rebecca's raising her hand about what we're talking about now.
Yeah, do you want me to chime in?
Yeah, I would love that. Thank you.
Okay. So one of the things with the steep slope rules is that the landowner operator, there's a lot of decision points that they make when they're planning their operations. And so we may have like the mapped steep sloped areas and the SRAs and the DDFTAs, but they get to choose between, there's decision points. So in terms of the process, especially for the pilot study, we would see what, is in Ferns, and then we would see what they proposed, and then they may slightly shift. So there's this whole component of kind of just administratively figuring out what they proposed to do, and then actually what was done on the ground. It would take a significant amount of time because they may not, they may choose differently if they choose 2 out of 5 or 3 out of 5. So there was a lot of decision points that we will need to figure out how to track what was actually done on the ground, what they proposed, and then figuring out compliance. So that was a logistic component that we need to think about with those rules, if that helps at all. Like we actually need to go on the ground to see what they actually did.
Okay, yeah, I guess I'm still curious. Is the initial coverage of those zones defined with LiDAR or field surveys or more legacy topographic data? What is the sort of the base, and I apologize for not being familiar with that right now. But what is the starting point in terms of defining these areas just from the outset?
I know Thomas is there, but TerrainWorks did a model, a steep slopes model, and that's what we have available for landowners to use to make their decision points. I don't know if Thomas wants to elaborate on that. So it's the steep slopes model that is the baseline.
Thomas is not here.
Yeah, he's not here right now.
Okay.
Yeah, if I could chime in here. So we randomly select notification of completions, and part of that process would involve overlap with these particular slopes model objects. And I guess that's kind of the starting point, I would say, is selecting those sites that overlap and then identifying sometimes for various reasons, we just can't sample them because there was an error or whatever. But then we typically do an overdraw of sites as well in the event that there's some that have to be tossed.
All right, Ellen, Seth, and then Josh.
Okay, I had first of all, I was going to ask essentially the same question that Josh did, so thank you for your responses there. But I also wanted to note that based on the question and response to AMPC request, the IRST now has a proposal that's under review for a rapid preliminary study to identify steep slopes, particularly in Eastern Oregon, and in particular mass wasting on steep slopes, as to provide a comprehensive bibliography and summary of findings from reading those papers. So I was just, and hopefully that'll be done this fall. As it's a rapid review. So so I was just curious whether you have a plan to integrate those findings into this steep slopes pilot study, whether, you know, that data can help, you know, your perspective on steep slopes mass wasting and what areas may be more susceptible to mass wasting because it's specifically for forest harvested areas.
I'm gonna turn this one.
Yeah, my understanding is steep slopes apply in Western Oregon right now.
No, this is a study specifically for Eastern Oregon steep slopes.
I know, but currently our role is looking at what's in rule now. At some point, if there are rules that cover Eastern Oregon harvesting on steep slopes, yes, if it's applicable to our work and it's helpful, we would rely on that as a source of information.
Thanks, Ellen.
Thanks.
Seth, then Josh.
Okay, yeah, I wanted to make two important points for folks that weren't, or that haven't been, are not terribly involved in the program. But I think it's useful to, if you go back a few slides, I think it's like your third slide, where you talk about, you've got, so no, there was, I just saw it. Go forward.
I thought you meant the whole presentation.
No, maybe not. Okay, keep going back. And it doesn't matter. Go wherever you want. The point that I was going to make is that you alluded to this earlier, and I just want to underscore it. That for those who are not super familiar with the Oregon Department of Forestry, there is two very important parts of compliance that the department does. One is I don't know how many stewardship foresters you have. What's a ballpark? 60 stewardship foresters that are out there that have units. Those people are triaging all the time, real time, overseeing active operations, new applications that come in for harvest, road building, all these things before it happens. And then after the fact, even going out and looking and seeing what happened, right? And sometimes those people are triaging just like a cop is going to do on road. You know, they're going to go to certain intersections that are problems. And that's the sort of thing that a stewardship forester does, which is why, this may go without saying, but that's why this sort of the monitoring of enforcement activity is not a good statistic analysis. It gives you where the problem areas are, and that's useful information. It can be useful, but it's not going to tell you, that's not a good snapshot for all of the state of Oregon when you're just looking at the worst intersection, right? And so the other side of this is the compliance monitoring program. And I think that's an important piece to understand. A few years ago, before the PFA even came out, there was already a revamping of this program ongoing that was making it more statistically viable to be able to say things across the statewide. Terry Free was very involved with that at the time. Several of us were involved there too. Then the PFA started and it became a part of that conversation. I think another important point for both these groups to understand is that this program, the compliance monitoring program, was a part of the PFA rulemaking as well. There was a bunch of new rules that went into place. They required that the program be statistically valid. They required that access be granted for the purposes of doing compliance monitoring. And they require certain timings for frequency of rule sets that will be monitored. And so that's all going into what the presentation here was. But I just want to, since that wasn't explicitly said, I think it's really important to note that this program is a part of the PFA. It was imagined that this would be sort of this gyration of roads and steep slopes and riparian. This is all part of the plan to be able to inform the board and the services of compliance. So anyway, a lot of words there. I just want to make sure that because we have a diversity of folks on both these committees, I think being grounded in that is really important.
Thank you, Seth. Josh?
Okay.
Good. Any other questions or comments? Yep.
I just raised my hand. But so Amanda, for the record, for folks that are online, but just to double down a little bit on what Seth was saying, kind of really to your question around how do we, because I'm on the committee as well, to determine kind of the not necessarily the critical piece, but the feasibility piece, right? The compliance monitoring program looks at activities that have been completed sometime many years after they've been completed. So it's sometimes infeasible to assess compliance that far beyond the activity happening versus the stewardship forester on the enforcement side being able to make a call as something is happening, right? And so I think just to be very clear, that's a way that we sort of kind of a screen and a test that a lot of us are trying to look at when we look at the kind of just the words on a piece of paper, utilizing our experience, saying, well, it's going to be pretty hard to guess that, right? So thinking about, and part of the discussion that we had around like ELCs, for instance, right? A lot easier for a stewardship forester to assess whether or not there's some type of soil issues happening in those areas compared to 2 or 3 years after the fact, whether or not there was bare soil at the time, right? Or whether there was a mitigation measure that was applied, right? So just kind of as an example about kind of that feasibility piece. And that's why I think it's really important and critical, like to the slide that Emily put up there on the implementation monitoring, that stewardship forester piece and the enforcement side is so important. And there was a lot of work in the enforcement rules done through the PFA as well, with the new formulas for how you determine what a citation is valued at, what the cost is, and then the new repeat violator list. So, and significant violations. And so there was a lot of stuff there too that like I had to explain to, the folks just like Seth did, to the folks who are out there who may have citations occur, right? And a lot of that was to try to let people know that this isn't, it's not okay. You need to know the rules, and we try to educate them alongside ODF around that. So hopefully that, not that we, hopefully we beat the horse to death, I guess.
Any other questions or comments, Kelly?
Well, I just piggybacking on that was very helpful because and then I'm just like thinking about some of the effectiveness or some of the BGOs and which group they go into. And the ELC definitely goes into the implementation group, at least partially. And so if I'm understanding what you're saying, then that would be more of an enforcement issue, but then how do we, yeah, I mean, how do we demonstrate to the services that we're, that there is compliance, if you're just going after you're tracking the enforcement issues, but you're not tracking some sort of statistical compliance, then how do you demonstrate to the services that you're actually doing what we say we're doing? So that, I think, is going to be something that we're going to have to wrestle with.
And to be clear, I think we'll get there eventually. Part of it too was that we were gonna, like the riparian pilot was happening basically the year that people started to implement. And so thinking about this massive change that everybody had to get familiar with, like it a little bit unfair to say everybody's going to get it right everywhere all the time, right? And so kind of the coupling of that plus this challenge around point of enforcement, right? Point of action. I think, again, I think that in the if I'm remembering correctly, in the conversations, I don't think anybody said we shouldn't. It was when's the right time and how are we going to do it? Needs, we need to be very, there's needs careful consideration, right?
Terry,
Yeah, I'm a sketch like that.
other comments? All right, it is time to take a lunch break. Thank you very much, Emily. And then we're going to kick off after lunch at 12:30 with Matt Strickland and talking about ODFW's monitoring program.
And FYI, lunch is up in the front lobby here, so.
See you folks virtually at 12:30.
No. We're trying to maintain that. But you got to make sure.
People that are working on things and then you get directed questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
CP, we got,
Yeah.
Umbrella.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll be there soon.
We're about to get started, folks, online. It's just a little peanut.
Yeah, it's not cold.
It's pretty sweet.
All right. So thanks, everybody. We had a couple good presentations this morning on VGOs in the compliance monitoring program. And now we've got Matt Strickland with the Corvallis Research Lab here talking about ODFW's monitoring program. So Matt, you are up.
Hi. Thank you. I am Matt Strickland. I work with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife at the Corvallis Research Lab. I work for the Aquatic Inventories Program and I also work with the Fish Research Population Data and Decision Support Program. I have to look at that every time because I can never remember it. The acronym that we go by is RED. So if I refer to AQI or RED, that's Aquatic Inventories Program. What I'm going to talk about today is the habitat and fish monitoring that the Aquatic Inventories Program has been in the past, some changes we're making and how we're applying that going forward, and how those can fit with the private forest monitoring as well.
Just, or sometimes you just need to break up.
Okay, so the Aquatic Inventories Program started in 1990. It started using, focus of the program starting off was what we call basin scale habitat surveys using a protocol that was developed at Oregon State University in the late 80s, developed around a unit scale habitat classification system. What that means is surveyors describe discrete habitat features within streams, so things like pools, riffles, rapids, and steps. And then those features, habitat attributes are measured within those features and then summarized in the reach scale. We're still using those same primary methods today. The one difference is we incorporate a snorkel survey component to that, a snorkel method component to that in 2012. So like I said, we describe discrete habitat features that, and within the bounds of those habitat features, we collect specific habitat attributes. Those generally fall around things that describe channel form, stream condition, in-stream wood and riparian canopy, as well as species observations. So account of fish, presence and absence of amphibian species, as well as any sort of beaver activity we see. Some things that we can focus on that fit with this group would be some of our substrate composition. So we describe various types of substrate composition. So in particular, the percentage of fine sediment, silt, and sand. Road crossing and potential barriers, we measure those. In-stream temperature and wood, the number of wood pieces of it summarizes wood volume. We conduct two different spatial scales and types of habitat surveys and fish surveys. The one we've been doing since 1990, and the blue lines on this are streams that we have, stream reaches we've surveyed since 1990, not continually since 1990, but at some point since 1990. These are continuous basin scale surveys. So these are generally surveys that are opportunistic and done at one time. So they're contract based. We will get contracts from folks like the Bureau of Land Management or Portland General Electric, and we do a survey that within the bounds of something that an area that they are focused on. So these are generally think of mouth to headwaters type surveys where we survey across multiple stream reaches. In addition to these, we also have restoration monitoring surveys we conduct. Both of these surveys primarily get at status. They're not something that you can look at anything outside of, you can't look at a trend necessarily with these because we're looking at one point in time with these types of surveys. with our restoration surveys, we do look at post restoration so we can get at condition as well. And then we also have what we're going to call for this talk our statistical sampling surveys. We've been doing these since 1998. These are randomly selected and spatially balanced across the landscape, and we primarily do these in Western Oregon. And with these, we can get both status and trend. So now I'll kind of focus on that statistical sampling surveys. We monitor these at primarily 3 different stratification scales. One is an evolutionary significant unit, or the ESU. The other is at the strata. So in this example, the mapped example here, we have the Oregon Coast Coho ESU, and within that, there's 4 monitoring strata: North Coast, Mid Coast, Mid South, and Umpqua. And then we can also stratify these surveys by the population area. There are 21 independent populations within these monitoring strata. Both of these have all of these monitoring strata, the scales at which we sample, have advantages and disadvantages. The advantage to when we monitor across large areas like the ESU and the strata scale, we get a broad spatial scale sampling, and we can detect trends across broad spatial areas. The disadvantages to that is we cannot detect changes or things that are going on specifically in smaller areas. We can stratify our sampling by the population areas, and we can get a condition in specific areas there, but we cannot get a changes that are happening at broad spatial scales, or what is happening with that particular small area, how that applies to other areas. So this survey design is based on sites that are randomly selected, spatially balanced across the landscape. It's also designed around a rotating panel design, meaning that these surveys have 4 different panels we pull sites from. And so 25% of sites we sample are surveyed every single year, 25% are sampled every 3 years, 25% are sampled every 9 years, and 25% are only sampled once. So across almost 30 years of sampling, there are 25% of sites that we have surveyed every single year, and 25% of those sites have been surveyed about 10 years, 25% 3 years, and 25% of them have only been surveyed once. Across all that time, we surveyed over 4,000 unique sampling locations. All that is to say is that, again, there are advantages and disadvantages to this. We have broad spatial scale to our sampling design, but about 50% of those sites we found have been the best at detecting trend. So with this, as we start to think about moving forward with our sampling, we are eliminating 2 of those panels, the 9-year and the once only panel, and we're going to now just focus on sampling from the annual and the 3-year panel and increasing the number of sites within those. So in the past, we may have pulled X number of sites in those annual 3-year panels. We're just going to increase those and focus on those panels so we can really focus on trend detection. Okay, so this is where some of the language difference, listening to the previous talks, I've realized there's some language differences in ODFW and fish research versus other folks. One thing I'm going to say now is when I talk about co-centric sampling or a species-centric sampling, I'm talking about one. In the next slide, I'm going to talk about species-centric. I'm not talking about an individual species, I'm talking about multiple species. So for the focus of our previous sampling, we've been very coho-centric, so an individual species. And within that, our habitat sampling was really focused on getting at the availability of the quantity and quality of habitat and the abundance and occupancy of juvenile salmonids coho within individual stream breaches. With those, we monitor those specific metrics to look at status and trends through time. And then we use those things to update measurable criteria that informed recovery plans. moving forward, we're not moving away from those same philosophies. But we are moving towards a more species-centric approach, meaning not just cove, but steelhead, Chinook, lamprey, cutthroat, etc. And within that, we are still focused on monitoring status trends, but we're also into quantity and quality of habitat. But we're really moving forward to how our habitat's connected through the stream network, and we're using connected through the stream network across seasonal changes. So we're not just monitoring one point in time, but also different points in time to see how connectivity changes through time, and evaluating species distribution across seasons as well. In addition, we're deploying a network of stream loggers, stream temperature loggers, to look at, to understand the thermal regimes across the sites we're sampling. And then also using some work Karen Antelope Dunn has been working on to look at thermal tolerance to see what stressors those fish are under. Look at using the thermal scape, results of the thermal scape, we get to decide what stressors those fish are experiencing based on the results we're getting. Now, that's all a boots on the ground approach so far. The one thing we haven't done a great job in the past with our monitoring is utilizing remote sense data and also model data, because that's been one of the limitations to our sampling and our data so far. We can get at these broad spatial scale results, and we can get at, when we have boots on the ground, with stratifier sampling to individual places, but we can't put all those pieces together. So utilizing remote sense data now, we can get outside of our boots on the ground location sampling, and utilizing existing models, specifically ones that look at stream temperature networks. We can start to get a better idea of what is going on with riparian and landscape conditions, as well as temperature within stream networks and how they interact with each other. So now moving forward to how these things could fit with the private forest accord habitat conservation plan goals. Our monitoring strategy fits in well with these goals, because we are focused on, this is where the language barrier comes in from hearing the earlier talks. We're focused on a species-centric approach. So not a singular species, but looking across species, as well as our sampling approach looks at habitat complexity, habitat connectivity, and temperature regimes across stream networks. And then our design fits well with the Habitat Conservation Plan monitoring group approach, in that we can still detect status and trends at multiple spatial scales. The figure on the right is from the past 30 years, looking at summarized wood volume within stream reaches and looking across monitoring strata. So the example or the figure shows within the North Coast and mid-South Coast monitoring strata, we detected a significant decreasing trend in wood volume over the past 30 years. Whereas in the Mid-Coast and Umpqua, we saw a increasing slope that was not significant. So with our previous monitoring design and our current monitoring design, we're still going to be able to detect trend across various spatial scales. And then with our current methods and the data we collect with those methods, I think we can get at some of the Habitat Conservation Plan goals and objectives. So for things like sediment, we do collect the percentage of fine sediments, so silt and sand. For shade, I want to point out here that it's not just canopy and shade and riparian, but I should have also included stream temperature. Connectivity are things like the unit types we collect. We can describe tri-channels versus riffles and rapids and pools, and also channel dimensions. So the amount of flow and water volume within those channels. And large wood is part of the complexity piece, but also not just large wood. We can also think about things like secondary channel connection and interaction with the floodplain. So how the valley form that interacts with the stream channel, how the stream channel interacts with. And then moving forward with all this, this is the part that I wanted to lead into or think about leading into the discussion part afterwards. So we have this monitoring, we have a monitoring plan in place already. It works well for us. But thinking about applying that to this group, I think, you guys have already thought through, it's pretty obvious you've thought through your goals and the questions you have, what you're doing. I think now the question is, how can we leverage existing data that we have already? We have 30 years of existing data plus 18 years beyond that of basin scale surveys and restoration surveys. If there are data available there, how do we apply those? And then there's the boots on the ground approach as well. What is the extent that still needs to be surveyed? And how do those data need to be stratified? And the biggest question in my mind going forward is, how do you balance status, trend, and also the approach of a pre and post if you're thinking about things that are being restored or looking at conditions? So are you focused on status and trend, or are you still focused on condition? Because those all have very different monitoring approaches. How you about them. That's it. Thanks.
Matt, Seth?
Question. Do you guys currently, that's an interesting picture. What's going on there? Yeah. Do you guys capture data on the adjacent land ownership? The question, really what I'm getting at is, because I would imagine your program looks at all ownership type, right? You're looking at the stream, so you're covering state land, tribal, federal, municipal, even potentially farmland. So that's a question I would have. Are you currently reporting like adjacent ownerships, and is forest land one of those categories, and is private forest land one of those categories?
Those are categories. We survey across land ownerships. We don't stratify our sampling by those ownerships. So when the data are being analyzed, we don't have, and this is Becky and Kelly here, who I think who have done far more analysis into this particular work. So please correct me if I'm wrong when I say this. We don't have because we didn't stratify by those areas, we don't have the ability to detect,
tease that information out.
Yeah, we don't have the sampling density. Yeah.
Okay, that was just a question I had.
We've attributed points by what the land use or ownership is, but we don't do any analysis.
Right, and you're not designing your sample to be able to stratify by that. Yeah. Okay.
David, then Ellen, and Haley.
Thank you. That was well done. Just to help clarify things for me, being a small forest landowner with, excuse me, quite a bit of creek on our place. In the past, ODFW for about the past 20 some years has been doing, and we're in the Clackamas River Basin, so different than what you were giving examples for. But you basically do two types of surveys on our place. One is a spawner survey, usually in the fall and sometimes extending into the winter, looking for primarily coho and then if funding permits, steelhead, winter steelhead, but that seems to be done on a more random basis. We don't, I've collected records of this going back since you guys started, and there's no, periodicity to it. So, and then relatedly, you also do a physical habitat survey, which are much more infrequent and also appear to be random. So the questions I have are, do I understand you now right, that you will be doing these more periodically? And so then that would help us get some regularity in the data that's being collected. And then secondly, since you do have quite an immense database, but I don't know if that's been digitized at all to use as baselines. So going forward for this program that we're initiating with the PFA, that you've got quite a repository of data here, but is it easily accessible, or is that going to be a large effort on your part to take that data and digitize it so it can be used, electronically? Those are my two questions.
First one is they're both great questions. The first one is great because you are right in your assumption that we are now we're basically merging those two programs. The original intent of those two programs, what he's talking about there is we have an aquatic inventories program that has been focused on stream habitat and juvenile snorkel surveys. And then there's also what we call it's our spawner program, so the Oasis program, and they go in the fall and winter. They conduct stream spawning surveys specifically for Chinook, coho, and winter steelhead. The original intent of those two programs fell under the Oregon Plan for Salmon Watersheds, and they were meant to work together. At some point, the two data sets never worked that well together because they worked on different stream lengths, essentially. And so it's hard to overlap them. Starting this year, we have decided that we're going to, the habitat portion of things we are going to survey the exact same sites that spawning program is going to. So Dave, you're exactly right. Those will be on the same timescales and on the same exact distance that we survey. So that we can get the intent there is to have a better understanding of fish and habitat associations. The second part of your question, we've been doing this for 30 years. I know on my end, if you ask for data or anybody asks for data, it's really easy for me to spit that out. And I think I can say the same thing for the spawning project as well. We have a data set that we've worked with over and over again. So the data we have in place, there's really not much to sharing that or getting it out there. Yeah, I don't know what else to say about that. It's easy.
All of the data are housed in relational databases, so we can query out
Just
attributes.
a quick follow-up to that is that when I've talked to Alex, for example, down there, he sent me the PDFs of the spawner survey reports, but then I had to manually input that data into my own spreadsheet database. So I'm wondering if going forward, there could be some really cool analyses done with this data, but is that, there seems like unless, there's other ways of doing it, that there would be some manual effort that would have to be expended in order to take that data and put it into some sort of statistical analysis program or whatever somebody wants to do with it. So, do you see understand what I'm asking?
Part of the explanation for that is that, we've made commitments with landowners to protect data that's collected from the land that they own. And so we tend to only share data with a landowner for their own ownership. And for most of the landowners that request data, it's, it might be just one survey. So all they're interested in that is that PDF. You're kind of in that in-between zone. And I'm sure that we could work with Oasis to get you, a spreadsheet or CF file or whatever of the data on your ownership. But we do have some limitations for sharing
data with people outside the agencies on, the data that's been collected on other people's land. So we can work with you. I think what we've committed to is that, we share analysis that's been rolled up into larger pieces, that's not attributable to a single reach or stream. But we can definitely work together to either get you the data that you need or run an analysis.
Okay, Ellen, Haley, and then Josh.
No, just really quickly, your surveys apply primarily to streams, right?
Yes.
But I'm curious, since you're also concerned about, you include amphibians in your species of concern. Do your surveys also include like side channels? Do they include, frequently flooded wetland areas that would be salamander amphibian habitat?
Great question. We are not herpetologists by trade. These are stream habitat biologists. They're also not beaver biologists, so the same thing with beavers. Those are just opportunistic data that are collected.
Right.
What we do train those biologists to do is to make observations as they're going through a stream and collecting information. And then they have a set number of intervals in the stream where they have to collect what we call metric information, which includes measurements of the active channel width, the flood prone width, and then also the valley floor width. And in those transects, they are looking for making observational data within that transect that they see.
Oh, thank you.
Again, it's one of those things whenever we report on those numbers, I forget always how that saying is said, but it's lack of presence doesn't indicate species, it just
right.
Spatial data.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you were to try to measure everything, you wouldn't even be able to meet.
Okay, Haley, Josh, Kelly, Becky, and then Amanda.
I'm curious, what questions you guys are targeting with this data collection? Like, I understand what data you're collecting and how frequently, but I don't actually understand like what questions you're trying to get at.
I'll take a stab at this and then Julie, please jump in if I miss this point. So originally, this started in 1998 as a response to Coho being petitioned as listed under as threatened endangered species there. So the question we were trying to answer is habitat quality improving through time? So that's where the focus was originally. Those were really taking the data we collect and describing those in habitat limiting factors to look at habitat quantity and quality. We have a pretty broad data set now that we feel comfortable answering this. Now, a lot of moving forward is still answering those same questions, but also being able to answer specific questions that come up with other species prior to delisting goals and measurable criteria within conservation recovery.
And the only thing I'd add is that, at that time and since, there are several different recovery plans for different species and issues that have specific goals. And so we have a mandate to report on progress, basically in stats and trends of these different attributes.
Some of what we're collecting now is trying to be proactive rather than reactive. So many of the questions we asked and we tried to answer in the past have really been reactive to something that's already happened. And now we're trying to think forward to what sort of data can we collect to explain things maybe going on in the future.
So just to make sure I understand, so it sounds like it's like trends generally at this kind of very broad scale, and then also like covariates that may be of interest or that you have hypotheses about habitat specific things.
Yeah.
And, going forward, temperature is becoming important question for us, but something we didn't really pay attention to during those first 30 years. Because on the Oregon coast, it wasn't really an issue. It was the winter habitat that was limiting. So that's why there's been this emphasis on getting a network of
monitors out to be able to be able to model temperature across streams paired with the thermal tolerance work to figure out, so what does it mean if we have this temperature here, especially since even within species that varies depending on what they've been exposed to and are acclimated to and that kind of thing. And so a better idea of what the aerobic scope is for, in different regions or specific places or the area in general.
All right, Josh, then Kelly.
Yeah, so that's actually a pretty good segue to my question. So how much are you coordinating with DEQ's laboratory and water quality assessment program? Because, you have the thermal scales there and then measure the temperature. And obviously we're in the putting out or redoing a bunch of temperature TMDLs that are very much focused on these species as far as the purpose of the standard. And then, like sediment, fine sediment, we do, have some areas listed for turbidity or sedimentation, where it's really a fine sediment listings, and then the rogue and some other areas. Particularly with biocriteria listing, where it's essentially macroinvertebrate populations are being inhibited or restructured or tilted by sediment and/or temperature. So to what degree are you coordinating with DEQ's laboratory and water quality assessment programs?
Yeah, so since 1998, we have worked with DEQ to redeploy and maintain temperature loggers in the 21 independent populations. So one logger in each one of the populations. So we still have those in place. Ron Cummings is the one that maintains those on our end for DEQ. DEQ is charged with all the data storage and analysis of those. And then we've also worked pretty closely with Shannon Hubler on the macroinvertebrate side of things to provide the data we have. His group. That's been our involvement with DEQ.
And I guess more broadly, Kara Adlefton is the one who's been tasked with coordinating our temperature sensing network. And I don't know the specifics particular to DEQ, but I know that she has been working pretty hard talking with multiple different entities that are collecting temperature data. I don't know how much of those, I think that's been more sort of data management level. I'm not sure how much discussion has gone on to like setting thresholds or, coordinating those kinds of things. And I just wanted to say too, as far as sediment, your shop probably has potentially some better approach. That hasn't been the focus of what the work that we've done. As Matt mentioned, pretty much all we can offer is the substrate. Yeah, exactly. Right. We should definitely look at bringing in the information you guys have on segmentation.
And I think I knew most of that. I just kind of wanted to get it out in the air. And then, something I'm thinking about that, so the ODF folks are dealing with is, kind of evaluating all those things from this, private forest accord wasn't a Clean Water Act plan, but the parameters are largely the same. And so, we're doing existing monitoring, you have existing monitoring, and then we need to look at effectiveness monitoring for the HCP, which is going to be looking a lot at temperature and, sediment regimes. So I'm just kind of wanted to get that out there because I'm trying to think of how do we not add like a whole new workload, but use existing work that ODF, ODFW, and DEQ already have to do. And then, do we need to add to that or connect that better to do effectiveness monitoring for the private forest accord rather than trying to build a whole new program from the ground up? And I know that's why you're here is for that reason, but yeah, it's like we're already, DEQ is asking ODF to do implementation plans and evaluation for effectiveness for meeting TMDLs, and we have our own monitoring and you have your own monitoring. So I'm trying to think about how do we take all that and
weave it together, something that's comprehensive enough to answer effectiveness monitoring questions for the HCP as well, rather than trying to do something new that requires a lot more resources that it doesn't seem like we're likely to get in a budgetarily sustainable fashion.
Okay, Kelly, Becky, and Amanda, and then we need to move on to the next agenda item.
Right, so I'll build off of Josh's, where he was heading. So you mentioned, that you're gonna drop the single and the 9 years. And so is there are you gonna keep sampling in the same locations for? We need to expand beyond what you all have done, just the Coho ESU. So those new sites, are you thinking about moving them out or just enhancing the sampling within the Coho ESU?
Right now, we're enhancing within the Coho sampling ESU. We're still, the reason for that is we're still bound within that other program. So the spotting survey program, and trying to line up our surveys with them. In the past, we have surveyed outside the distribution of an attribute. We did that, I think we ended those surveys in 2014. So 1998, 2014, we surveyed within what we call, so we have different sampling frames we work within. One of those would be tidal non-weightable. And right now, nobody surveys within those. Then you have, for the most part, a Coho sampling frame and a steelhead sampling frame that overlap each other. That Coho sampling frame has a spawning distribution and a rearing distribution. And then there's also a habitat frame, and that's the headwater sampling. And we surveyed up to streams, so streams as small as 0.6 kilometers squared.
For the contributing area.
Yep, the contributing area. We ended those surveys, like I said, 2014, and there really hasn't been much talk about going back to those. I do know we have a private forest accord biologist at each district station for the most part. And they're doing some surveys now that are a little bit more, they're a little bit habitat based, but again, they're opportunistic as well because they're the ones that are, there's a timber sale going on, so they're getting those surveys.
What I think you may be getting at though, Kelly, this project, you still have outside contracts, right? So that it's already worked into their workflow to be able to handle our organ plant sampling and then also take on contracts for others that focus on specific things. So, and when we drew that spatially balanced sample, it was with points every half kilometer for the entire stream network. So it would be possible to intensify in the areas that would be important to the HCP and, just have an external contract that would allow for additional sampling in order to boost what they're already doing to the levels we'd need to answer the questions that we have, of course, here.
Okay, yeah, that's really helpful, both of your answers. And then, we're gonna need to look beyond just the Coho ESU all across the state. And so I assume that you all are not doing that you're just gonna focus within the area that you had shown on the map.
No, not necessarily, because like Julie just said, we do have those other positions. So we still have a basic program in place. That basic program is a statewide program.
I know we're sampling the John Day this year, right? There are other places on these things.
Yeah, we're sampling the Buttes,
Yeah.
Mason, John Day, and we have some work in the mix. We're doing surveys of the Minam next year in Pine Creek. It flows into the Snake River, way out there.
But in order to be, to your point though, in order to be statistically valid for the entire state, right? I mean, it seems like you'd have to beef up a lot of those other areas.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so that's what I was.
There's some running into the same wall that we've run into
Right.
now, even with really intensive sampling on the west side, still have limitations to what we described there. So,
Yeah.
But there is a logistic framework that it could plug into.
Right.
We've already been working there. We just have to.
Okay, Becky and then Amanda.
Kelly started to ask one of my questions for you, but I wanted to follow up on that. You said that you were expanding the surveys to overlap more comprehensively with the surrounding sites. Is that the only places you're going to be surveying? Or are you still going to be surveying juvenile rearing habitat?
Yes, we are still serving juvenile rearing habitat as well. So because the rearing habitat approximately makes up 15% of the total go frame, 15% of our sample sites will be within that rearing frame. And those will still be about 1,000 meters.
Yeah, so, and then, the other question again lines up with, which you've already answered, like the need to expand the frame, across species. I think
That's in the mix. So we're working on it. There's a lot to that. We have a non-weightable sampling protocol that we have tested, and we have been applying it in with our effectiveness monitoring. We have effectiveness monitoring grant, or we have a contract right now in the Clackamas Focused Investment Partnership. We've been there for 7 years, and we've been applying our non-weightable sampling protocol there, and we would like to expand that to the non-weightable sampling frame across the coast and elsewhere.
the only other thing that I would add is that you're on the federal side still doing a lot of thermal monitoring. You guys aren't connected up with them yet.
I think we are, but yeah.
And that's something that we're talking about expanding more.
Okay, Amanda, then we'll move to the next agenda item.
Okay, my question is maybe less technical. I don't know, maybe not. But Josh kind of mentioned this already on the DEQ side. I was just curious about that. I'm just looking at the HCP objectives that fit with the ODFW monitoring slide that you had up. I was curious about how you were connecting the sediment with the percent substrate composition, and I had a question. I just wrote turbidity ? So it sounds like you guys aren't measuring turbidity, but maybe that's something that pairing up with DEQ, you guys do look at turbidity.
Yes. That's something we run into as well, is we don't have like turbidity monitors deployed out there.
Okay.
Most of our listings are either based on sedimentation, which is bedded sediment. So percent fines is high enough, it's causing us spawning trouble basically. Or if we have data sets for turbidity where it's like not a one-time water pollution event that we enforced on, but where it's an ongoing problem, that's typically come from someone who's measuring turbidity daily, like a public water system would be measuring turbidity in their raw water at the intake. And so if they're having a consistent, pattern of turbidity that's high enough to interfere with purification operations, that would like pop up and maybe like trigger a listing. Otherwise, our listings are sedimentation, and they would be based on data from like Forest Service or ODFW or something else that shows a consistent like finding of the street bed. So turbidity events themselves, if they're not like someone was working on a road and made a mistake, or someone was doing a construction project and made a mistake, where it's like it was observed and then injured based on a complaint or a discrete pollution event, then it's typically going to be related to a different beneficial use. It could be related, right? So if you have consistent high turbidity, that can cause problems for fish, for like feeding, or that can be an indicator that there's a lot of fines being eroded in that will then settle into gravels or cobbles. But we don't have like a network out like we do with temperature loggers.
Okay. Yeah, and I'm not well versed in this space. And so I just didn't know if the substrate composition that you guys are collecting at ODF&W, if that could only be a cause from some sort of sedimentation event, or if there's some level of geography, geology and parent material.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so just again, trying to get at this, like, okay, what are we looking at here as far as effectiveness and what the cause is? I would be interested in having more of those types of conversations around like what's actually being caused by the things that my members are doing versus just things in nature, right?
There are models out there of, that estimate background sedimentation rates that we could bring in.
anyways, I was curious about that. And then the other piece that I just don't know much about is kind of the connection point here on the connected and the connectivity. And I don't know what the unit type and channel dimensions. I didn't know how those two things were connected. I just don't know what that is.
Yeah, so the unit type is just, well, if we're moving upstream, those are discrete habitat units. So there are things like pools, riffles, rapids, but we also describe dry channel information, cold channels. So that's where you can get at connectivity with those is the percentage of those, when you the length and the width of those areas that are disconnected from other channel types.
Okay, so you're kind of creating a like a picture of what that channel looks like over a length of space.
Got it. Yep.
Okay, I just didn't know what that meant.
And when he was talking about valley width, et cetera, you get sort of a different stream type if it's constrained than if you've got a real broad valley, then it can wander all over it.
Okay, so
stuff.
so for that
Yeah.
piece, what you guys are collecting is sort of, it's not gonna be the right words, but you're sort of.
We spent a whole week with new people.
Yeah. So you're sort of, kind of creating, like those types of physical attributes across the stream channel.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, guys, we have got to move on because we are behind schedule. Matt, Julie, thank you very much for that. Really appreciate it. And so we're going to move now into the effectiveness monitoring strategy, and I'm turning the reins over to Terry here to sort of help us kick us off.
Yeah, so first of all, just a comment. There's a lot of really good information here. This is a big thing to move forward on. And so I think at the end of the day, today, we're hoping there can be some agreement about, do we want to kick this to a work group? How best do we keep this moving forward for these committees and developing this strategy? And then, was there anything else in terms of kicking that off that you're suggesting? Like,
Just keep, I guess it's for the group to just keep that in mind as you hear this presentation, what are those next steps that you'd like to have one another think about to keep moving this forward? And that's where we'll kind of end with that to see if we can get any of that to gel, noting no decision will be made today, but we're just looking for what are you thinking about in terms of the universe of possible next steps that could help move this thing down the road.
And then I'm going to go ahead and advance the slides if I can figure out how to do that. Oh, I see. So we're, and then Stacy, go ahead and jump in if you want to interrupt me at all. I figured I'd go ahead and give this and then let you jump in as you want. If that sounds good, Stacy. Okay. So big picture reminder, this is required for the draft of the HCP, as Jennifer mentioned earlier today. You can also think of this as strategy as an operational guide for AMPC and IRST, how it's moving forward. Several purposes, high-level overview of adaptive management program operations during the term of the HCP and ensuring that all VGOs are evaluated. The monitoring framework to guide how the studies will be addressed, and then study priorities and how do we track and report that back to the services, because they're going to want to hear from us on a regular basis. I mean, they will, but that's built into this. And then there's a framework of metrics and targets, trend targets may be included in the strategy that, the HCP, as I read it, is a little less clear if that's definitely part of the strategy or a parallel process, but just noting that. So this is one way to go about it. There's these for status and trends, one way would be for the AMC to direct IRST to refine the metrics and trend targets, as it says in the draft HCP, and developing a strategy to do the status and trend monitoring, keeping in mind what level of detail might the services need, would be most effective for actually doing it. Those aren't necessarily the same, but just keeping those questions in mind. IRST doing that work and then reporting back to the APC to adopt the initial metrics and trend targets. That deadline per the draft HCP is 120 days after getting that report from IRST. On the
Terry, if I can just jump in
Yeah.
quickly too, sorry.
Go for
But
it.
just wanted to add that, you know, we kind of put this flow chart together. You all, at least on AMC, know I love a good flow chart, just to try to articulate, pull out from the HCP actually that I think there is a little bit more clarity in the process than maybe it might feel kind of reading it. And I know that those closer to it, like myself, even for us, it's sort of hard to pull that out. So that was kind of the intention here, was just to show that there is a bit of a process and a sort of conceptual framework for starting this work. And then I think that there's some important lessons we can learn from our neighbors to the north in Washington and the SEMER process. So we'll dive into that, but just wanted to give a little more context so that, you know, the HCP kind of clearly lays out some roles for both AMC and IRST, as far as IRST kind of starting to refine those metrics and trend targets. And we talked about, you know, in our first part of the discussion, a lot of good questions about that and why that matters. And then some of the timelines that are included here too. And just to sort of like pull the threads together, I did pull out those metrics or the metrics that we have that are in the HCP that need to be refined on this slide too, just to give a little more context for kind of what we're talking about.
And then in a similar process for the targeted monitoring studies and post-triggering event analyses, groups 3 and 4. You know, a suggestion is to use the prioritization process that was pointed out in the SEMER document for prioritizing projects based on scientific uncertainty and risk to species or habitat. You know, IRST doing that work and or getting some help from an outside contractor. Then AMPC again reviews that work from the IRST on groups 3 and 4 priorities to sort of move that into the strategy there. And Stacy, any more you want to add on that?
Yeah, thanks, Terry. You know, I think that this could and should happen in parallel to the status and trends work. And this, you know, the BGOs that fall in these two groups, there's a little bit less direction on the process, but just kind of in digging into how SEMER was approaching this, and would love to have this discussion in more depth, and maybe we can bring some folks from SEMER to meet with us. Made a lot of sense in sort of front loading the work in the science committee to give information grounded in the science around, you know, how much uncertainty there is on a particular rule set or BGO, and then the risk to the species if assumptions about it are wrong. That would give, you know, the policy committee, AMC, some really good information to then prioritize, you know, with a policy lens on top of that, and then kind of fold that into a strategy. So just to be super clear, you know, this isn't written in the HCP that we do this process. I just thought, and Terry and I chatted about this a bit, that, you know, this framework could be really useful. It helped me sort of think through a more manageable way to approach this. I'm sure there's other ideas, but this made sense. So we wanted to open it up to the group for more conversation.
And then this is just highlighting the timelines in the HCP. The effectiveness monitoring strategy will be established. Let's see here. First one is strategy will be established. A timeline to begin status and trend monitoring, along with ID of metrics to be monitored and associated trend targets for each sub-objective. IRC report its findings to the AMC within 1 year of issuance of ITPs, and then within 120 days of that, the APC will review and adopt that initial set of monitoring metrics and trend targets. So that's what, you know, this is verbatim out of the HCP. And then it also says AMC and IRC will work together to establish an adaptation program effectiveness monitoring strategy, and then including but not limited to idea of a monitoring framework, prioritization, and timeline to ensure all the EGOs will be evaluated over the permit term. And this strategy will be completed within 1 year of issuance of ITP. So kind of highlighting what the HCP says here, literally highlighting verbatim. This is just the group one only VGOs here. And I'm gonna just gloss through these quickly so there could be more time for conversation, since you've seen the group 1 through 4 already in a couple of presentations earlier today. And then this is a little more info on how SEMR did their prioritization process. If I understand it, they did this about 25 years ago and then revisited it for focused projects. But again, it's scientific uncertainty and risk to resources is the basis of that. And then they come up with this table, an overall ranking that's based on both uncertainty and risk. And pulling out an example here, using the road prescription scale, effectiveness monitoring. Overall, it has a ranking of 9, uncertainty of 2.6, risk of 3.1. So again, there's some details in this document of how they went about that. I think it's a useful model to at least do a first cut of prioritizing.
Harry, do you have any, can you go back to that slide?
Yes.
And maybe it's the question as well for Stacy. Do you know when they did this exercise? SEMR, was it
I
pre
think it was 2002.
ITP or post ITP? Or just at the, I am just trying to get a sense.
Yeah. It's 2002, so I don't exactly know when the.
Which would have been right at the issuance. I think that was issued in 2002, I believe.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah, okay. I was just curious, the timeline that they were under as well.
Okay. Yeah. So just back to some big picture things. As I read statute, AMPC has the final say on the strategy, but really they need significant input and even development from IRST on this. The HCP does say that the metrics and actually should say trend targets. That's IRST with possible support of a contractor. And then key elements, again, monitoring framework with an overview of the study priorities, and a process for doing that, timeline to update the priorities, and then tracking and reporting. So that's sort of the big picture and a quick look at the effectiveness monitoring strategy. And so now it's really good to open it up for questions, comments, and I'm going to invite Jennifer to also answer questions as they may relate specifically to the HCP. And I know there's a lot you might not have the answers to, but part of it could just be this is a consideration.
Kelly. Yeah, I just wanted to say that some of this work has been done in terms of the grouping, so we have prioritized based on level of understanding BGOs into the different monitoring groups. So that was sort of the first step. And now the next step is within each of those groups, prioritizing based on the level of science and the risk to the species. And so I just wanted to say that, but I wanted to come back to the metrics and trend targets. And that's basically for the status and trends piece at this point. So going back to some of what we were talking about earlier from ODF and W, you all have been collecting this data, for 30 years. We know which types of metrics, sediment and riffles, or fine sediment and riffles, large wood, so we've got an idea of the metrics. But then the trend targets, can the data that you all have collected help us identify what those trend targets should be? You know, do you have confidence enough in the large wood? So, back again. So for the BBNC, we know, you know, that is a physiological based metric and trend target, temperature, BBNC target. But for some of these other things, we don't have that. So for like large wood, we're going to have to figure out how to come up with a target based on large wood or for large wood. And so can some of the data that you all have collected over the years inform that? And so, yeah, so that's the answer.
So, yeah, I would think potentially, Kara has done most of that work, and it'd be probably useful to sit down with her and talk about you might be able to speak more to that, Matt, but yeah, I would think that potentially it could be back in 98 when the recovery plan was made for the coast, and it was like the first one we'd ever written. You know, we had no idea where to start. It was pretty simple. It was just like trends are either flat or increasing, right? If it's decreasing, then it's, you know, a concern. But then we never defined like, okay, how much decrease, you know, how big an issue is it? If it is, you know, slightly decreasing, is that a concern? Even, you know, if it's or so it's difficult. It's a difficult job to come up with meaningful thresholds for sure, but I think it'd be useful for Kara into that discussion because she's worked a lot with the trends.
I think she'd say the same thing. Maybe we share an office long enough. I think sometimes I can channel.
Yeah.
I think it depends on where you're asking that question too, right? Like, I mean, we're asking that question in a small enough place as human disturbance, previous land use practices. What do we need to see in those places? Or are we asking that question in undisturbed areas? Or are we asking, you know, I think it depends on where the question's coming from. I think there's a lot there. I was trying to think through all the things, you know, we have thresholds already for restoration practices, what we ideally want to get to at a reach scale. So are we going to try to approach those? And if so, I don't think that's attainable everywhere. I think it really depends on where at that point.
I've asked Kara the same question that Kelly just asked, and I recall, I think for key pieces, so above a certain size, the error bars were so large that it was difficult, I think, and we didn't necessarily feel comfortable setting a target because there's just so much variability.
I don't like to report on key pieces because there are so many zeros in the data that there is so much error. So generally, when we look at wood, we look at number of pieces total. So key pieces are those that are longer than, I'm going to use metric terms because that's what my brain's going to think right now, but longer than 10 meters in length. So that's about 30 feet long and 60 centimeters in diameter. So it's pretty big pieces. Those are big pieces that you just don't see everywhere. So generally, we report on, when we think about wood trends, we think about the volume per 100 meters and the number of pieces total. So pieces that are greater than 15 centimeters in diameter, no longer than 9 feet.
David, then Amanda.
Just quickly, just as a frame of reference, one thing we use at the Clackamas River Basin Council is a study done by Abbey and Montgomery done back in about 2003, where they looked at undisturbed watersheds up in the Olympic National Park. And in there, they basically categorized large wood by structure type, as well as the watershed area draining. And so they were able to find a trend, albeit, you know, as someone mentioned earlier, the error bars, you know, its nature is pretty wide, but nonetheless, you can discern certain trends that help you to allocate on a cost benefit basis the amount of large wood that you would put in a certain basin given its size. and also the type of large woods engineered log jam you want to create. So as it was also mentioned, it's also a function of the size of the wood and, how long do you want that wood to last? And so I think all those things, as was mentioned, it's a complex issue, but nonetheless, you can start to get information about that to start to set baselines going forward.
Thanks, David. Amanda?
I hope this isn't too novel of an idea, but, so just looking at the questions here that Seymour asked for the group 3 and 4 type questions. One thing that I would sure be interested in, is this concept around, certainty and or uncertainty is, cuts both ways from the perspective of, if we are, not certain that something is, positively going to affect the covered species, but also the certainty of it being too much in a way. So that one, that 10 extra feet or 100 extra feet of the buffer, does it actually have the desired effect? Does it gain us anything, right? As I think about the folks that I represent, especially. And so I'm wondering if there's an opportunity for us to have a dialogue of including, if we want to go the same direction that Seymour went, which I think is not necessarily bad, but is a conversation around an economic impact or the economic uncertainty or the uncertainty of the assumptions resulting in a significant economic impact to those having to follow them. So I'm coming up with this on the fly, so I'm sorry that it's not well articulating. I'm not articulating it well, but I think there could be an interesting dialogue there of how we prioritize incorporating something to that end as well. And I've been thinking a lot about where we've included rules where there, to my knowledge, there isn't a lot of certainty around the science on the need to have the specific rule, where it's creating a significant economic impact on the cost of doing things in the woods. So I don't know exactly how we could potentially fit that in, but I think it would be of interest. If we can articulate something, it would be of interest to me at least, and how we prioritize.
Ellen and then Jennifer.
I think that economic impact could be an interesting dynamic to include, but we have to remember that the fish in question here migrate from the headwaters to the ocean. They basically mature and then they become an economic staple for fishermen. And so I think we need to, if we're going to include economic impact, then there's a whole variety of economic impacts that we consider, and that would include coastal community impacts as well as inland impacts, or non-fishing people. The impacts on ocean ecology. There's just the impacts on stream ecology. Fishermen in streams that are, buying lots and lots of Orbis gear. So, I think if you want to throw economic impacts into this, then we need to think on a broad scale. I think that would be something to possibly consider. But I think the charge of this of the PFA and charge certainly Seymour and of other groups and other packages of considerations also include the also include and prioritize the recovery of species. And so I think that also has to come into.
Thanks, Ellen. Jennifer, and then Seth.
Yeah, just really quickly from the HCP perspective, I think what the services are gonna be looking for is that ecological relationship. And looking at trends, you know, species ecology and how we're achieving what we said we're gonna achieve. For where the economics, I think that personally, this is just my personal bias or thoughts from ODF, but I think that fits best with like the Board of Forestry and their decision making for changes in rules, which is later in the adaptive management process. But I think as far as like this group's charge and effectiveness monitoring strategy, should be thinking about the ecology more than anything else. I think that's what they're gonna be for. At least I haven't seen in the HCP realm where their economics are brought in specifically for monitoring. It's brought in another factor, but not for monitoring.
Just a quick thing about rule, there are few little things sprinkled out specifically in the rule about economics. And one is that management program research may test whether operationally less expensive prescriptions can effectively meet BGOs. So that's one element. And then there's a thing in here about there's a way to include MC may request the department to hire a third party to complete analyses specific to that operationally less expensive prescriptions. So that's where economic fits as called out in rule to the adaptive management.
Thanks, Terry. Seth?
I was just gonna say the same thing. Thanks for looking that up, Terry. I remember that there was some specific places where it's brought in. So I think it's a valid point to just put a pin in, and as we have conversations about specific, areas of study, that should be something we think about so we can inform the Board of Forestry if it's feasible to do so, right? And depending on the study design and things like that, there could be ways of teasing that out that would be useful. I know that one of the overarching goals of the adaptive management program is to look at economically feasible or least burdensome or something like that. I can't remember the term it uses, but it's one of those types of terms, alternatives to achieve the goal. So it gets at the thing that you're talking about.
Thanks, Seth. Wendy and then Kelly.
Yeah, I think that kind of links back to what Jennifer was saying. And to me, that language you're reading, I think has to do with what research questions can be proposed and appropriately go through AMPC process versus this process that we're talking about. I think we've kind of agree on that point.
Potentially, yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
we can. Yeah, it definitely has a place. I don't know, to your point, if it like needs to be embedded in this strategy necessarily. But we should look at the rules and make sure that whenever as we get.
I guess I was saying, I thought that what you were reading from was the section that has to do with like research questions that would be addressed by AMPC.
It's before that, but it's pointed to that within there. And I guess I would also just say, don't forget, this whole effectiveness monitoring strategy isn't really addressed in rule. In any kind of comprehensive way. There's a little thing that says, oh yeah, effectiveness, adaptive management program will do effectiveness monitoring, but the monitoring strategy is not addressed specifically in rule. It's not out of bounds by any means, but there's trying to forecast what the HCP, what the services will need, and then there's just operationally what you folks will need for this to be successful. It's sort of the way that I frame what is driving the strategy.
Kelly?
Yeah, and if we're going to do this prioritization now, I think, having the discussion of whether or not what role economics should play for the HCP monitoring strategy. And if we're going to do this, excuse me. Thank you all. Somebody else go on. Sorry.
We've got Seth, Amanda, and then Sean.
I was gonna go to something else.
I have a follow-up,
Okay.
if that makes sense.
Yes.
So I guess my where I continue to have some clarity issues is if this strategy moving forward will set a priority agenda for how we develop and where we focus research questions moving forward. Like how does our development of research questions and the research agenda tie into, or not, I guess, the effectiveness monitoring and the strategy that we're discussing at hand?
And now I think I can talk.
Okay.
So that's where I was trying to head, is that we've got these 4 different groups of monitoring, and group 3 and group 4 are research questions. And so I don't know if we would want to do this ranking for group 3 and 4, including the economic considerations, so we have that down the road, or if we would want to do the ranking just for the HCP monitoring requirements now. So that really is sort of a point of departure there as to which path we want to choose now. So, yeah, thank you all for your patience.
So glad you're.
Yeah, I was gonna move us in the direction, just looking at my watch of like thinking about the next steps in terms of how do we take this discussion and start. I think Stacy and Terry put together some interesting, concepts and slides about how we could potentially think about how we narrow down and steps that we would take to get there. So the question I would have to pose to the group would be, where do we go from here? Should we go back to our respective organizations, the AMC IRST, meet separately, have some follow-up discussion, chew on what we've got here today, talk with each other, and then the co-chairs can get back together and discuss maybe joint next steps, or maybe it's a work group, or I don't know. I just trying to figure out, where do we go from here? And I know there's this question that we haven't really talked about today, but a few of us have been involved in some conversation about, whether ODF pulls in a contractor and how that would work and what that might help with and some things like that. I think there's a lot of good energy here. This was a great first sort of meeting to get us sort of grounded. But then the question I have is like, okay, where do we go from here?
I think what would be helpful for me is to understand like what tangible thing we need to produce next, right? I get a little bit lost in like, where are we with these PGOs and effectiveness? Like, do we need an effectiveness monitoring plan within the year? I think those kind of tangible things might help, at least for me, think about like who should be meeting next? What committee should we have? Should we all meet together?
Sean, you have a.
I was basically going to ask the same thing as Seth, saying like, the Washington effort, they convened science advisory groups kind of around each, like roads around, it's kind of it's going to be a big task, right? Trying to prioritize all these different, both broad scale status and trend monitoring, and then a couple of other categories of monitoring. So yeah, do we have ideas for next steps in doing that?
Stacy.
Yeah, I think really appreciate the conversation, and that was really the intention of just to share CMER as a conversation starter. It does not need to be the path that we take, but I do think I would love to kind of leave this conversation with some degree of shared understanding. Maybe it's just where I am, but that to me, it seems like the direction from the HCP and the way that this makes the most sense is, the IRST with your science expertise, with your ability to hire contractors and that capacity, really providing a lot of information on sort of the science to best prioritize this work, and really kind of helping to frame that up. So then the AMC can come in with a policy lens, and maybe that's where the economic piece comes in, implementation of the rules, to sort of then make some decisions around priorities. So I guess I see in my mind sort of a bulk of work on IRST's plate to kind of start framing that up, and maybe following a path like CMER, or maybe something else But I just wanted to check my assumptions, I guess, about sort of next steps. Is that tracking with others, or are there different thoughts on that?
Amanda and then Wendy.
I think Julie had hers up.
Oh, I'm sorry, Julie, I didn't see you. Thank you.
I just wanted to respond to what Terry said, you know, in putting forward some different options about what we could do next. At some point, I don't think this was necessarily inform prioritization, so maybe it's somewhere down the road, but I think it could be useful to have, particularly on this, a work group that includes both members of IRST and some of our members. Specifically, you've done some work with SEMR, haven't you, Becky?
Yes.
Yes, and Josh and I could both comment on the capacities of the agencies and what they're doing right now, and it might be useful to get a small group of us who worked specifically with putting those things on the ground to come up with some kind of, you know, test case that's more concrete as to what Haley said, that, you know, then we could pick apart and decide what we wanted to do differently at some point down the road.
Thanks, Julie. Amanda, Wendy, and then Lisa.
Okay, I have two hopefully quick things. So I haven't been a part of the HCP conversations, the development of the BGOs, et cetera. So the way I've been thinking about this, but maybe I'm making a horrible assumption, is that the way that these have been grouped, like I think it has been brought up, some of that workload has already been done for us by kind of determining how we are going to monitor each of these. Am I right to assume that those things, especially grouped in group 3, would be the initial priorities because we have already identified that they have the most uncertainty? Or is that not fair? Like, is the intent that we focus research questions on those first, but then we have some standing drone of monitoring that happens around the other pieces at the same time, and it's our job here to determine how all of that fits together? Like, kind of to Haley's point, like what exactly is the next step? I guess, as somebody who hasn't really been engaged.
Seth, were you wanting to address
Yeah.
that directly before?
I mean, my perspective, it's, and correct, others probably have different perspectives. But I tend to think of like the status and trend stuff is really important to start soon.
Yeah.
Rather than later, because we have to establish a trend and we have to figure out how to start monitoring that to see what happens. And so I think those that fall under question 3 are important too. But when I think about question 3, I think about group 3 questions. I think about all the questions that we already have. We've developed a process in the adaptive management program for coming up with those questions. I think that those are questions that would be group 3 type questions. Those are more like the standard research question type stuff, such as the what are we calling it? The amphibian question 3 type questions. Those are, in my mind, those are already moving into that, that space. Those are the group 3s. And so I think I pictured this strategy largely as a way to sort of organize in one place what has already kind of been organized both within the IRST and AMC and the HCP. And not completely, but a lot of it would just be putting it in one place and saying, here's the strategy, pulling from all of these documents and places saying, here's who's doing what, here's how we're grouping these things, here's how these questions get prioritized within AMC, and then it goes to IRST, the Board of Forestry is involved here and there, right? And it just outlines that whole, and that is, boom, your strategy. Now, there would need to be more to it, is what I envisioned, some additional pieces coming into that. But I didn't think we were going to be pulling something whole cloth here that would be different than any of that. I thought the strategy would largely pull and describe a lot of what we already have.
Okay, so we've got 5 minutes left. We've got Wendy, Lisa, Stacy, and Michael. So
Yeah, similar to Seth, I was thinking sort of a project management kind of a conversation in which when we had the working group on this earlier, what we did was got examples of other kinds of effectiveness monitoring plans that are put together. And, that I would think would be kind of a model for this. I guess an initial question is, in the examples that we had in the slides, like that showed different ways of doing it, like the IRST is here, does that sound feasible? That bumps a great deal of work to you in the sense, so that's a question I have to you. And so again, I think if it's a typical project management thing where like we figure out what the big picture priorities are, who's going to do it, if it's feasible for IRST to do what's in these flow charts. And then I do think that the initial grouping is a form of prioritization, saying that the targeted research is an important thing to get underway. And additionally, from a time perspective, status and trends also needs to be an early priority. I said that as fast as I could.
Good job, Wendy. Lisa Gaines.
The AMPC would have to give the IRST a charge. Just like we were given a charge with the road hydrologic connectivity, amphibians, steep slopes. And I don't think we can do anything until we have that charge. And we'd abide by exactly how it's written in rule. That once you give us something, we have 45 days to respond and we move from there. If there is work that you would give us sort of like a mini charge, should we say, if it's this research and work with Simmers to find out what their priorities are, then I think we could help step on that early. But I think we actually need a charge to actually do the work.
Thanks, Lisa. Stacy and then Michael.
Yeah, two quick things. Amanda, I just wanted to respond to your comment about group 3 and whether that was sort of relative priority. And just to clarify, and Kelly can probably articulate this better than I, but group 4 is very similar, but it's a little more like depending on those triggering events like a landslide. So it's harder to sort of control the timing of, and again, this is, I'm not an expert on this, but that's my memory of it. So just articulating that they're both sort of equally important, but they're a little bit different. And that's why they're separated into those two groups. And then Lisa, to your point, I guess, and I wanted to again check my assumption, but the HCP is pretty clear, like AMC directs IRST to refine metrics and trend targets. There are metrics included in the HCP, like we were talking about, related to shade and the BBNC. So, as a potential next step, could we sort of like put that down on paper and send that to you so that you all could start work on that? I mean, in a way that seems to me like a fairly straightforward next step. Obviously, it's one part of multiple streams that will need to be happening, but does that flow track with what others are thinking if we were able to sort of pull that together?
Thank you, Stacy. Michael?
Yeah, I think at this point, it would be great to focus on the fundamentals, and that is the questions that need to be answered. And what is the job description of this program? And get a meeting of the minds on that and make sure that we're really solid on that before we proceed to tactics in that. What is this supposed to be applied to? What do we all mean by this? I think that would be really important. And just saying status and trends, and that should be able to answer all our questions doesn't cut it in my mind. So,
Thank you, Michael. Okay, so we've got about 2 minutes left. It sounds like based on some of the great suggestions we've heard for possible next steps, that a potential good next step might be INR and Terry convening with the co-chairs of AMC and IRST in discussing some of the options that were recommended today for next steps and charting a course for each of your respective committees that you can take back to them and talk about with them before taking another step. Does that make sense to you, Seth, Kelly, Stacy? I think Jessica's not with us here anymore, is she? I don't believe so. Is that just based on?
I mean, at this point, it seems like that's probably our only next step. We need to make sure we're on the same page to Michael's point.
Yeah, and we do have like the suggestions Stacy has made and others. We can get those documented so that as you go into your meeting together, you'll have what was heard today. Because this wasn't intended to be a decision conversation. It was just to sort of get the juices flowing. In addition to that, and just as a reminder, I think ODFW and ODF are going to share potential examples of other HCPs with the committees, just so that all of you could see some other examples. And then there was also the suggestion of convening with some element of CEMR in some way. And you can have that conversation when you guys get together as well and decide what you want to do with that. Is there anything else for the good of the order today?
Thanks ODF and W for the presentation and ODF for the compliance monitoring.
Love everybody, and we'll circle around the wagons again and come up the other end of the pipe with something to move this forward. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
When we were having the conversation about compliance monitoring. So you had commented about sort of.
Yeah.
The.